Oh, hi.
Hey Praveen, how are you?
Oh, great. Thank you. I want to thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
My pleasure. Thank you for getting in touch again. I was excited to see the current affairs connection so much so I told you I turned my daughter onto the magazine. I forwarded her your email and I said, "How cool is this?"
Oh, really? Uh, well, I guess I know you're busy, so I'll just get kind of right to the questions.
Please.
So the topic of this article is political thrillers and the way in which political narratives are kind of inserted into them.
Yeah.
So I guess first of all, how would you describe your politics?
I think I think most people who if you were to become aware of my position on various issues, you might describe me as generally left in my politics. I think that's fair.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I, I I don't really like to identify myself as anything particular, certainly not as a Democrat or a Republican, because I think the more closely you identify with anything in this world, the more it impedes your ability to try to accurately and as impartially as possible
Mm-hmm.
analyze whatever situation is in front of you. So, and that's true particularly for partisanship in America, where you can see partisans of both sides do it. In my opinion, rightist GOP partisans are worse, but it doesn't really matter for purposes of the argument. You know, once you're a Democrat, then everything someone from the GOP does is bad. And once you're a Republican, then it's
Mm-hmm.
flipped. And you can see this actually in the behavior, for example, of take someone like Rachel Maddow, who I would describe as
Mm-hmm.
liberal, not left. But back in the day in 2008 during the Democratic primary when Obama said that he'd be willing to meet with any world leader without preconditions, which to me is so sensible a position that it should be axiomatic. Um, he was pilloried by the right and by establishment Democrats like Hillary Clinton in the primary.
Mm-hmm.
So that's crazy to just give away the galactically important prize of a meeting with the American president. And so that was the general consensus that it would be crazy to meet someone without preconditions. And then Trump did one of the few things that I can say I think was a good thing, which was he met with Kim Jong Il, or at least that was Kim Jong Un, rather. I would say it wasn't a bad thing, at least. It was certainly better than them trading nuclear insults and
Mm-hmm.
nuclear taunts on Twitter. I didn't think much would come of it other than maybe a lessening of tensions, which is no small thing when you're talking about
Mm-hmm.
nuclear arms. But the left went, or at least liberals, including Rachel Maddow, were like, "Oh my God, can you believe Trump is meeting with this guy?" And I was like, "Wait, I thought the liberal position was that, like Obama articulated in 2008." So that's an example of liberals just completely flipping the script depending on who is in
Mm-hmm.
power. And I think and I could give you what the right and Fox News does on this is, is an order of magnitude worse. But either way, a lot of what causes this is when you start to identify with a team. Like, well, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, then it's my team. I got to defend my team rather than trying to, as dispassionately as possible, search for what's accurate and useful and true. So anyway, sorry,
Mm-hmm.
that was a very long answer to your question, but it's just why I'm always a little reluctant to say, well, this is what I am. And the only thing that I would say is, this is about current affairs. I love Current Affairs. It's such a great magazine because I think I mentioned in my email, I just find the writing is so great and it's so thoughtful. And they've changed my mind on a few things, which is it's not that it's particularly hard to change my mind. I actually think I'm probably easier than most because I don't cheer for a team.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it's not easy to change people's minds necessarily, and they've done that on a few issues. So kudos to them, but they call themselves a socialist magazine, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
accurate. It's totally up to them. But I don't like to call myself those sorts of things. It gets in my way. And when I discuss, for example, topics like socialism or capitalism, as I'm wont to do, because I think those terms are so emotionally laden in America. The term socialism has been so demonized here, and the word capitalism and the market have so been elevated to the status of a quasi religion in America, so much so that I'm actually amazed we don't capitalize market in America. It's this weird exception. We even
Mm-hmm.
capitalize internet. And you see things, and it's creeping into like the homeland gets capital H,
Oh,
and
yeah.
Trump is always capitalizing nation. I mean, these are things like, God and the Bible and things. And now we're doing it with these. ostensibly secular things. It's amazing that we haven't done this with the market yet, because we certainly worship the all-knowing market in America, and we're trained to do that. But I think that, and therefore I think that because these terms, socialism and capitalism, have become so emotionally laden in America, the amygdala just lights up and people can't think. When you say capitalist, you say socialist. So when I discuss those things with people, I never say, well, I'm this or I'm that. I actually don't know what I am. It doesn't matter to me. What I say is, I think we just should ask questions such as, why is it that public K through 12 is not socialism? And we've agreed as a society that taxpayer funded K through 12 education is a good thing, not socialism, not the end of civilization as we know it, et cetera. But publicly funded, taxpayer funded college education would be socialism and bad and evil and ruinous. There may be a very good answer to that. And when I say that, I don't think there is a good answer to that, but there may be. And I'm open to that good answer if it's out there, if somebody wants to provide it. And then we can discuss this. So anyway, that's like when I talk about something like socialism or capitalism, I try to just take the emotionally, like the boogeyman words and all that stuff out of it, and not take a position myself, but just make it more remedial like this. Like, why is it that publicly funded roads and a publicly funded postal service, which is under attack right now, but that's a separate story, and a fire department, a police department, and services like this, if we've agreed as a society that these are things that we should use taxpayer dollars to fund, and that's not socialism. But so if that's the case, but then why are those things not socialism? But then say taxpayer funded health insurance would be socialism and bad because it's socialism. And I think that's the right way to approach these questions for anyone. And certainly when I'm trying to get people to look at things more differently, that's the approach I use. But it's also the right approach, I think, for me, because if I don't approach it that way, then I might start, even if just unconsciously, cheering for my team because I'm a socialist, or I'm like Nancy Pelosi, well, we're capitalists, and that's, I'm sorry, but that's it. You know, which is just like, what, did you turn your brain off to say that? What does that even mean? I mean, that's the way people talk about a religion. It's true. So, you know, there's nothing to discuss. Anyway, sorry, that was an extremely long answer to what you probably thought was going to be a simple.
Oh, no, thank you for that. Yeah, and then on the other side, I think Nathan J. Robinson just got in a little trouble for comparing Marxism to a religion. So
I didn't see that.
Oh, well, it's just a small thing online. It's
So you know what I would say off the top of my head, not knowing much about Marxism, I don't think it's unfair. And I'll tell you why. I live in America, which is, as Nancy Pelosi said, a capitalist country. That's what we're inculcated with from the earliest age. And I think capitalism is treated in America like a religion. That being the case, why wouldn't it be the case that Marxism is treated as a religion in some ways elsewhere? In fact, there are so many things about humans that we approach without realizing it the way we approach religion, that are not technically religious things. That's just something I've observed about humans. So I don't know why Marxism would be immune in some weird way from all these other axioms of human behavior, at least as I've experienced it.
Yeah, and I think the same could be said of any kind of ideology. There's a danger of that.
For sure, exactly. That's it. Once you stop being open to the possibility that you're mistaken, or that you should refine your views, or that you don't know everything, and that this ideology doesn't answer everything, and you have to be flexible. Once you stop being open to those things, then what are we talking about? We are talking about a quasi religion.
So, you know, avoiding kind of these broad labels, I think it's safe to say that your books touch a lot on things like the counterproductivity of the war on terror and the drone campaign, the criminal kind of activities of the intelligence gathering apparatus, things like NSA surveillance.
Right.
So kind of a lot of these civil liberties issues and foreign policy issues. And, kind of one of the things you notice in thriller authors is a lot of the ones that are kind of the first that come to mind, like Tom Clancy or maybe Vince Flynn, they tend to be pretty conservative on those issues. A lot of them are proponents of the war on terror, torture, kind of an imperialist U.S. foreign policy.
Yes.
And do you think you made a conscious effort to try to go against that trend in publishing, or was it more of something more natural?
So that's a really interesting question. it was conscious in the sense that I was aware of it,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't conscious in a premeditated sense. It wasn't as though I looked at the political landscape of political thrillers and said, you know what, I think there's like a niche here for a leftist political thriller, because all the big thriller writers, as you said, like Vince Flynn and Brad Thor and Jeff Beck waded in. Not Jeff Beck, I'm sorry, Glenn Beck waded in
Oh,
at one
yeah.
point with a book I actually reviewed, The Overton Window. Good title, but I can't. And it's not because of my opinions about Glenn Beck, but the book just didn't work as a thriller or a novel in my opinion. But that's secondary. But anyway, yeah, you see all these the big thriller writers are typically, as you say, they got this very conventional American establishment media narrative about how the scary Muslim brown-skinned peoples hate us for our freedoms, and that's why why we're just so nice and we don't do anything and we're minding our own business and people just keep attacking us. Like, why do they hate us so much? That's what we're fed. I mean, right from then President Bush Jr. after 9/11, hate us for our freedoms, which is completely nonsensical. It's contradicted not just by everything that Osama bin Laden ever said. And you know what? If you want to say, hey, that's bin Laden, he's just trying to bullshit us, and he can't admit to himself that what really drives him is his hatred of our freedoms. A Donald Rumsfeld Pentagon study came to the same conclusion. They don't hate us for our freedoms; they hate us for our policies. Maybe our policies are good and worthwhile, and we should keep doing them. But this notion that they hate us for our freedoms is just emotionally its intention and its effect are to self-pleasure, to eliminate any responsibility for anything bad happens, and it's everyone else's fault, which is a human tendency. So my politics aren't driven by anything I want to represent in my novels. What I want to represent in my novels is driven by my politics. And my politics, who can really say where their politics? We think we know, but who really knows? I think, we humans we think we're these Vulcan creatures just ruthlessly, rationally, analytically analyzing everything and drawing logical conclusions based on the data. And what we really do, I think, is that we reverse engineer from the conclusions we want to reach for emotional reasons, and then we create this scaffolding after the fact of logic and reason and all that just to comfort ourselves. So it's hard to know. But I will say this. Back to current affairs again. One of the things I love about current affairs, even when I don't agree with the magazine, the reason I think every American should read current affairs. I'm not making a pitch for the magazine, but I'll tell you why. I mean this seriously. When I was in college, at some point I realized I didn't know anything about the world. And so I embarked on this solo quest to just learn about what's going on. So I said, well, what are the big periodicals, the big publications that all smart, educated people are reading to learn about the world? So I read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic Monthly, the New Republic, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Review of Books. I don't think I'm leaving anything out. That was my staple and I read those things religiously. I studied them. I never missed a copy. My roommate used to make fun of me in law school. He's like, have you caught up on your periodicals today? And I'm like, no, foreign affairs is hard to keep up with. But that was it. And I thought I was educating myself. And in one sense I was, because I was definitely getting a lot of information, huge amount of information. When I applied for my job with the CIA this would have been around 1988, I got a 50 out of 50 on their geopolitical knowledge exam. Yeah, I'm still proud of that because I was self-taught. But most of the people who are applying are government or political science majors or grad students from the Kennedy School or the Woodrow Wilson School or whatever. And I was a psych major and had no real, I took some history classes and that sort of thing, but all the stuff that enabled me to ace that exam, it was all self-taught. So I am proud of it. But the point of that discussion was to show, yeah, I learned a lot of information, but all those periodicals have at heart a single worldview. And it's really hard to understand that this is a worldview, an ideology we're being fed as Americans because it's being fed to us from almost every corner. So people are always saying, oh, bipartisanship is dead, for example, which is an absurdity. It's just that it's in the nature of things. We notice the fights. Our attention is drawn by a fight. So if the parties are fighting, maybe they're fighting over, should we increase what we euphemistically call the defense budget, which I think should be called the War Department, just like it was a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Although I understand the tactics behind it. We're not going to have a War Department anymore. We're going to have a Defense Department like that.
Right.
And we America only have defense spending. We don't do anything except in self-defense. We're America. Anyway, the argument is over. Should we increase defense spending from 700 billion a year to 770 billion a year, or is 700 enough? Or should we only increase it by 70 billion, or should it be increased by 130 billion? Those are the arguments between the two. I actually prefer to call Democrats and Republicans as two wings of the party. I think that's a better way to understand what happens in America. And then we are like, wow, the parties really hate each other. Or they're fighting over a Supreme Court nominee or abortion. Because there are, like women's reproductive rights is one real area of contention. But the areas of cooperation are vast compared to the very few areas of competition. And we don't notice the areas of cooperation because there's no fight. So, so everything you get from all the periodicals that I mentioned a minute ago shares a fundamental view that I would describe as this. This is, to me, Americanism. America is a good country with good intentions in all we do. We're a beneficent, generous, peace-loving people who only want to share the blessings of liberty with everyone else in the rest of the world. And if occasionally we make a mistake, like we kill 3 million people in a war on the other side of the country, or the other side of the world in Southeast Asia, pause to consider that number. What would you say about another country that killed 3 million people in a war on the other side of the planet? But it's America. So what we say is, as Ken Burns said at the end of his documentary, it's a tragedy. Call that a tragedy. Tragedy is like an earthquake or something like that. People die in an earthquake. An imperial war is not a tragedy. We've never called what Russia did in Afghanistan a tragedy. That's nomenclature we reserve out of generosity for ourselves. But anyway, this is what we're taught. We're kind, generous, well-meaning people. And if for some reason we make a mistake, it was an honest, well-intended mistake, and we feel bad about it, but what are you going to do? We spend $1 trillion a year on defense. Other countries spend it on war. I could go, obviously, I'm sorry, I already have gone on too much, but I could go on and on about this, but that's Americanism, and you get it from everywhere. The Economist was another periodical every week, routinely. I still read The Economist, but their coverage of certain areas is good. And they can be somewhat heterodox in various ways. For example, they've long been against the war on drugs. They were early on for gay equality, including gay marriage. So they're good on those sorts of things. But when it comes to war as a primary instrument of Western foreign policy and the goodness of America's wars, and by the way, we don't even call them wars, we call our wars interventions. Russian wars are invasions. Ours are interventions. It's hilarious. But anyway, I mean, the nomenclature alone is, you could write a book on it. In fact, I've been collecting these terms and I got to write a blog post. But anyway, so a magazine like Current Affairs, as I say, is an antidote to all that. When I recommend it to people, I say, you may not agree to it, but you should read it because it's going to give you a different view. Likewise, The Nation, to which I also subscribe, and Jacobin, which I don't subscribe to, but I read it online. I'm like, this is so antithetical to the prevailing, omnipresent American political narrative that we're fed from childhood, that read it, see what you think. And you don't have to be anything. I don't consider myself to be a socialist. I really don't know what I am. It doesn't matter to me that much. But you don't have to be anything, but get a different point of view from what you're getting from the people who rule the country. Right? Doesn't that just make sense? Sorry. And one more thought in this regard. You know, everything that I've ever learned about humans in my 56 years on the planet is that we cut ourselves a lot of slack. There's even, if you're curious and you don't know about this, Google fundamental attribution error.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. It essentially means that if I do something wrong, it was an honest mistake because I know myself and I'm a good person. It must have been an honest mistake. But if someone else does something that I think is wrong, well, I don't know that person at all. The wrong thing that person did is the totality of that person for me. And so that means it's a bad person. And everybody does this thing. And so we we have this reversed perception for ourselves, we do to other people, and it leads to the fundamental attribution error, leads to a lot of conflict. Well, what's true for individuals is also true for in-groups and larger groups like nations, which is just a giant in-group. So for all the people who think that America is so good, actually, I got to send you one other thing I wrote, and I'll tell you all my politics in a nutshell. But it was me trying to explain American wars to a Martian.
Oh.
The post I did. And the Martian was like, but you have like 850 military bases all over the world, and you spend $1 trillion a year in the military, and you all these wars, and you killed from all this kind of stuff. How can you say you're peace loving? And I was like, well, we don't want to go to, I mean, it's always, and the Martian just couldn't get it. And I was having more and more trouble understanding. And at one point I said, okay, look. And the Martian's like, look, but isn't that its own form of terrorism? And like, isn't terrorism intended to shock and awe? And isn't that what you call your bombing campaign? It's shocking. Why is that not terrorism? And I was like, look, I'll tell you what. One thing we don't do, we don't burn people alive. Okay, that's ISIS. They're barbarians. They put people in cages and they burn them alive. And we don't do that. And the Martian said, but did you Americans yourselves not invent napalm? Napalm is short for sodium palmitrate, which is jellied gasoline. Does that jellied gasoline not stick to the bodies of humans and melt their skin? And are there not photographs? And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. But I don't think we use napalm anymore. I think it was more like Vietnam era. And the Martian's like, but did you Americans not yourselves invent a missile that you called the Hellfire Missile, celebrating its capacity to burn? Does it not have something called a thermobaric warhead? Thermobaric, Greek for heat and pressure, and the thermobaric means that it creates a pressure wave of tremendous heat that incinerates all the human beings within the blast radius, and you celebrate this effect by calling it the Hellfire Missile. And I'm like, fuck. Like, I got nothing for this Martian. And it's because the Martian's right. So one thing I've learned about human nature is that we always cut ourselves all this slack. I mean, if Iran had a missile called the Allah Fire Missile, we'd be like, oh my God, like all those primitive, Islamists and, driven by religious whatever. And by the way, we talked about things that are like religions, even though we don't think of them. American nationalism.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Of course it is. And it would be much healthier if we could recognize it as a religion. But anyway, so the fact that we both innately as humans and by tremendous cultural inculcation are inclined to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt in everything. You give America a pass on everything. And if we do something that's so egregious that you can't avoid acknowledging the harm, then what we say is, okay, it was an honest mistake, it was well intended. Given that this is the prevailing ethos and mentality in America, I think we citizens owe it to ourselves to at least expose ourselves to a different point of view. And you're not going to get that point of view from any establishment media outlet in America, certainly not on television, all the corporate news on television, but I'm talking also about the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. All these publications share that fundamental, they don't think of it as imperialism, but American imperialism is good, the indispensable nation, the nation all the other nations wish they could be. By the way, Obama said that in a speech, I think it was in 2011.
Oh, really?
Further than usual, we're the greatest country ever in the history of mankind, which is itself a hilarious new species of humor because you've got all these people like Marco Rubio, and I think it was Samantha Powers, maybe. It's its own species of tweet. Like, okay, America's a total basket case when it comes to the pandemic. And these people are saying, how could this be happening in the greatest country on earth? And I'm like, oh my God, you're so close to an epiphany. So I think if we could just get a contrary point of view, maybe we could see ourselves more accurately than we're able to see when our view is exclusively filtered by our ego and our desire to see ourselves in the most charitable possible terms. And that's why this is something that the blogosphere started me on when I first encountered it, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago. Andrew Sullivan, who gets very hopped up on war. I once wrote a blog post about Andrew. It's called "This Is Your Brain on War" because he just loses his mind. He's a smart guy. He's a good writer. I disagree with him on all sorts of things. Although salute for being so far out ahead on gay marriage equality. I mean, he brought that up when, even as I understand it, like, numerous parts of the gay community were like, that's going too far. It's too ambitious. We're going to lose support. And he was, of course, substantively and morally right, but it turns out that he was tactically right too. So huge props for that. But when it comes to war, Andrew Sullivan is he's impaired. He's actually mentally impaired, I think. But anyway, he was one of my early blog encounters, and then Glenn Greenwald and Scott Horton of Harper's Magazine. I was like, oh my God, it was just this antidote to what I was reading in the fucking New York Times op-ed pages. So I wish more people would do that.
And I think you even dedicated one of your books to the bloggers. Is that right?
Yeah, that was I think it was Inside Out. Yeah, because they provide an alternative. And obviously the line between what is blogging and what is journalism is, if it ever existed at all, it doesn't exist anymore. But the David Brookses of the world try to pretend it does because their status is extremely important to them. I get it. It's human.
Well, thanks for that answer. Going back to kind of thrillers, I think you mentioned in one of your blog posts that because a lot of the most popular thriller writers are conservative, there are kind of people in the publishing industry who take it for granted that thriller readers are conservatives. Do you think that's still the case?
So the only way I could answer that question is just by a feeling or a sense. I don't really have any data I could rely on. And what I would say is, yeah, it's probably true. That's such a great question. Okay, I'll say this. So recently I came across this quote which rung absolutely true for me. I forget this gal's name, but she just left MSNBC, and she wrote a great post about why she left. I retweeted it, and it was the first time I've heard of her, and that's why I can't remember her name. But she quoted some network executive as saying, people don't come to us for the news, they come to us for comfort. And that's certainly true, particularly about television news, but it's true about a lot of things. I mean, that's where confirmation bias comes from, that sort of thing. We're psychologically good at filtering in things that favor our biases and screening out things that contradict our biases, because contradicting our bias, anything that contradicts our biases produces discomfort, and we don't like discomfort. So given that, I'm sure that just like people, if you're a rightist, you'll want to watch Fox News because it validates your worldview and it provides comfort and pleasure. And I'm sure that that's true if you also are a thriller writer. You'll want to read thrillers that confirm your worldview. And if your worldview is that, the scary Allahu Akbar shouting, people hate us for our freedoms, and like we never did anything wrong in this whole world, we're just such nice people, and then they try to blow us up anyway. If that's your worldview, then you will definitely want to read Vince Flynn's books. And no disrespect to Vince Flynn, who died tragically young of cancer some years ago. I wasn't a fan of his books, but he was a very nice guy. I think he sincerely believed what he believed, even though I think, he's wrong about all of it. I'm sure he would have said the same thing about me. But the people who read his books, there's no way, I think it's very unlikely that they don't agree with the politics in those books. And then it just becomes a question, well, are more political thriller readers rightists who will want to self-pleasure by having their rightist worldviews validated, or are more thriller writers leftists who will look for that sort of self-pleasure? And I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know the answer to that. I do know that I get a certain amount of feedback by mail and otherwise that's complimentary, like Barry, thank you for presenting things accurately or whatever. And of course, we think things that are accurate are things that we agree with. That's fair. But I probably get more mail from people who say, I used to like your books, but I can't stand your politics, so I can't read you anymore. And it's more that they encounter my blog, which is causing them to hate my politics. Although I do sometimes also get feedback about the politics of the books itself. I don't know if you had a chance to read that post I sent you about my novella, London Twist.
Oh, yeah, I did.
Okay, so that's an example of people were complaining. And by the way, I'm not complaining about them complaining. I just feel like I always want to be clear about that. Everybody has a right to an opinion, certainly, about something as subjective as a novel. And I don't think I should be free of criticism. I actually always, to the extent I respond, I always thank people for reading the book and considering it, and that's from the heart. So, but the complaints were about the politics in the novella, and the complaints interested me, as you know, for the following reason. I'm like, wow, it's politics that you don't agree with that seem like politics to you?
Mm.
If you have that rightist imperialistic worldview, then the fact that they hate us for our freedoms, that's not politics. That's 2 + 2 = 4. What do you?
Mm.
Whereas politics like mine will seem like politics. Probably might be true in the other direction too, although probably not, because I don't know. We just understand that everybody is taught they hate us for our freedoms. I'm just using that as one example of the overall phenomenon. So I don't know whether there are more rightist thriller readers or more leftist. And many times when people write me or put a comment on my blog or whatever that says, okay, I don't read you anymore because I hate your politics, what I always say is, I appreciate you having given the books a try. And I get that it's hard in many ways to separate the artist from the art. And I think anyone who says that one has nothing to do with the other isn't really grappling with the question in any sort of a deep way. Like when you learn about an artist who it turns out was a terrible misogynist or rapist or anti-Semite or you name it, it does cause us to look at the art somehow differently. I'm not saying it means that the art should be shoved down a memory hold or book should be burned or anything like that. But there is this relationship in the human mind for good reasons, I think, between the artist and the artist. So the art and the artist. So I never say to people like, what do my politics have to do with my novels? That's not fair. I'm like, look, I get it. Different people have a stronger or weaker connection between the artist and the art. It's all good. Appreciate you trying my books. Thank you for the feedback. And if you think that because my politics are bad, you shouldn't buy my books anymore, by the way, I support that too. I support people's right, whether I agree with the nature of the boycott or not. I very much support people's rights to express their politics with their wallets. So, if you feel like the right thing to do is not to support me by not buying my books anymore, that's completely fair. And even though I don't agree, obviously, with the individual case here, in principle, I agree very strongly. So again, thank you. I usually get really surprised responses to these sorts because people are expecting me to be defensive. But again, this is what I try to separate myself, like not to have that big identification thing going on. Even with myself to the extent possible, like instead of feeling like, what, how dare you not like my book? How dare you not criticize my book or criticize my book? I try to think, no book is for everyone. And my books don't have special dispensation. And it's, it's really okay. So anyway, another long answer, I'm sorry. I don't know whether there's more of one or more of the other. I'll just say this is what I was gonna say. When people tell me, well, I'm not gonna buy your books anymore and you've just lost a customer, which is a comment I'll sometimes get. What I say is, I understand that I'm probably losing readers, some readers. I may be gaining even more, there's no way to know, but I'm certainly losing some, at least from what they tell me, because they don't share my politics. And I say, but I would be ashamed to change my politics in the books or anywhere else because of fear of losing some readers. To me, that would be like someone paying me to suppress my opinions. And I'm not just a novelist, I'm a citizen of America and also a human living on a planet. And I would be ashamed to take money to suppress opinions that I think are important and that I want to share. So if I wouldn't do that for a direct cash payment, why would I do it to make a royalty on the sale of a book? It wouldn't be right. And that's what I tell people. And hopefully there's a certain level of mutual respect that we with. So I didn't do the politics of my books aren't deliberate, but I am aware that in just the same way, I think everybody should read current affairs, for example, as an antidote to the prevailing narrative. The prevailing narrative in American thrillers is what it is. Right. They hate us for our freedom. And so I think it's useful to have to have a political narrative in thrillers that is contrary to the prevailing narrative. And to the extent, I'm not a journalist, and sometimes when I look back at my life, I think that could have been something I would have found very satisfying. Journalists are my heroes. Good journalists, I know. We shouldn't have to make the distinction, but real journalists. And I think the work they do is so vital. Really, it's always been that way, and I know that more now than ever before is a cliche, and it's probably usually not true. But I think you can make an argument for it today. But at any rate, their work is extremely important, and to the extent I have anything important to say about politics, or that might get people to look at America and the world in a slightly different way, it's important for me to try to contribute to that conversation. And I don't have a big journalist's platform with which to do that by whatever chain of events have transpired. I am a novelist with a pretty decent following as a novelist. And so that creates an opportunity for me to try to get people to look at the world a little differently through my novels. Now, my novels are primarily what Graham Greene called entertainments. I want them to be entertaining. If they don't entertain you, then they have failed. I don't care what else they do. I mean, you probably won't even read it if it doesn't entertain you, so it can't really accomplish anything else. But just because something's entertaining, which you can analogize to food as something that tastes good, that doesn't mean it shouldn't also have some nutritional value. And so I want some nutritional value in the novels. Like if you know, and there's nothing wrong with entertainment, by the way, that, you know, like indelible characters who stay with you for a lifetime and will affect, and like you feel like you understand humanity better because some novelist has so perfectly portrayed a human. I mean, that's beautiful. That's art. I hope I have managed something at that level. It's more up to readers than it is to me to decide that. But if I can put some other kinds of nutritional value in the novels, such that people might look at the world differently politically, then I feel very fortunate to be able to do that, and I want to do it. And so I do. And I also think that last thought on this, everything I do in my novels is as realistic as possible. That's not, this wasn't a planned thing, it was instinctive, but it's definitely become part of my brand. So every place I write about, I travel for on-site research, and I take photographs and detailed notes, and I publish the photos of the actual places that appear in the books, and websites and that sort of thing. You can find this on my website if you're ever curious. All the websites and location information for all the bars and coffee houses and jazz clubs and that sort of thing that appear in my books, in case anybody ever wants to visit or see a photograph, or like in martial arts moves, I'm like, hey, if you want to see a video of somebody doing a flying omoplata or whatever, here's a video. It's pretty cool. Like everything I do, I want to be as realistic as possible. And all the spy craft is what I learned myself at CIA, all that kind of stuff. But I want that to be true for the politics too. Like I'm not interested I'm trying to create worlds in which I have dropped fictional characters into real world settings as closely as possible. That's what interests me, and that's my brand. So why would that not be true for the politics too? And I think that They Hate Us for Our Freedoms is a self-pleasuring fantasy. So I'm not writing fantasy. I'm not that fantasy isn't a great genre. I'm a big Game of Thrones fan, the books and the television show, although I think the television show collapsed in the 8th season, but that's another story. Fantasy is great, but I'm writing something that is as real as I can make it in every way, including the politics. And so that means politics as I understand them.
So speaking of kind of the difference between fantasy and what you try to do, which is put people in real situations, I think you know, political thrillers compared to science fiction or fantasy or some of these other genres, which, you know, are able to be political, but usually have to couch it in some degree of metaphor. Whereas like a political thriller, you could you know, cite actual laws that are, you know, exist in real life. Do you think that's an advantage when it comes to presenting information or putting forth a, you know, a political theme?
Say it one more time. The advantage of
the advantage of thrillers compared to other genres, in that you're kind of less reliant on metaphors and you can be more specific.
Yeah, it's funny. I would say in many ways, in the more obvious ways, it is an advantage. And in the less obvious ways where it's not an advantage, I think there are some topics that are so psychologically defended against by a person or a population that you can only approach them obliquely. So take a book like Animal Farm. You know, at the time, there was, at least in Orwell's eyes, a lot of sympathy. George Orwell in Animal Farm was clearly trying to approach the topic of totalitarianism in a way that wouldn't engage people's existing political sympathies and hopefully to get them to look at things in a fresh way. And by the way, I should send another article I could send you, but I don't want to overburden you. I'm sure you have more than enough. I once wrote an article for NPR on 1984, analyzing the book as a political thriller. People don't usually think of 1984 as a political thriller because it's actually a great story. I reread it a couple of years ago, and it's really well done, just as a novel and a story. But it's obviously best known for the war. It's tragically ignored warning about, you know, the Ministry of Love and double think and crime think and the memory hole and all the concepts, and we've always been at war with East Asia, all those concepts, which, and the 2-minute hate, my God, so many concepts that have entered the lexicon, but have unfortunately not, in my opinion, been sufficiently appreciated by, it's like, no, this isn't a thing from 1940, whatever, when the novel was published, and it's not just a thing in a novel. Like, this is a thing you're actually doing right now on Twitter. The 2-minute hate, this is what you're doing. So, but anyway, so that's an example of a thriller, a political thriller, that's had a huge impact. I wish it could have had even more on our understanding of politics and the lexicon. So, so anyway, the answer is it's both an advantage and a disadvantage. You can definitely approach things more directly because I'm dealing with, as you pointed out at the outset, big political questions like bulk surveillance. What do they call it? Data collection. Everything's got a euphemism. What did Keith Alexander say? We're just to find the needles. We just have to collect all the hay. I wrote about that too at one point. I'm like, that makes as much sense as saying, because there's no organic connection between needles and hay. So thinking you're going to collect all this hay to find some needle makes as much sense as saying, well, to find the lettuce is we need to collect all the bicycles. It's like, why would there be a lettuce in a pile of bicycles? I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but wow, that's a lot of bicycles. You know, where's the lettuce? It's just crazy. What he really means, by the way, is this is what I talked about in the article. I said, it makes no sense logically to collect hay in order to find a needle. What Keith Alexander doesn't want to say, because he knows it might be offensive and Americans might start to question this bulk surveillance program, he really means to find the needle, you need to collect everything, which is how they put it in their internal slides, collect it all. But that would be disturbing for the public. So he comes up with this bucolic metaphor. Looks like a, you know, what's that famous painting with the woman in the field of wheat looking back at the barn? Andrew Wyeth, girl in the field. And it's supposed to be like, well, that doesn't sound so bad. He's just a little guy in a barn with a rake collecting some hay. And I mean, thank God too, because if there were a needle in there, somebody might step on it or sit on it and get injured. So yeah, thank you, Keith. If you don't mind, I mean, raking up all that hay for the good of America, well, that's wonderful. So it's bullshit. You know? I mean, it's tactically great line, great propaganda, but it's bullshit. So anyway, advantages and disadvantages. I like writing in this form because I don't know that I'd be very good with allegory. It's an interesting question. Maybe I'll try it sometime. But I like to address these big questions of torture, the efficacy, the cost of torture. Actually, just spend one moment there. That's not something that the establishment media ever presented itself. So like when Jonathan Alter in Newsweek after 9/11 said, is it time to think about torture? Wrote this article. First of all, no, it's not time to think about torture. It's never time to think about torture. But that's a separate story. But what you'll never see from someone like Jonathan Alter, who's going off about how torture is good, or Lindsey Graham, who was opining the same way during some Senate hearings years back, they will never discuss the costs. They only want to come up with a fantasy hypothetical where the terrorist has planted the nuclear bomb under Los Angeles, and the hero has captured the terrorist, knows that the terrorist planted the bomb, knows the terrorist knows where the bomb is planted and how to defuse it, and knows that he will get the terrorist to give him the accurate information about where the bomb is and how to defuse it by torturing the terrorist. That has never happened ever in the history of intelligence, and it never will. It's a fantasy. But regardless, when people trot out these fantasies, they only want to talk about the good of terrorism. What if it could save your whatever? And they never want to talk about what it costs in the form of wild goose chases, in the form of shutting down what in the CIA used to be called walk-ins, volunteers, people who would walk into the embassy. They weren't recruited. They wanted to help. What law enforcement people would call confidential informants of one form or another, like people who want to cooperate for whatever reason. It could be money, it could be ideology, it doesn't matter, but they want to help you. But if they think that, hey, my cousin's been doing some bad shit and he's going to blow himself up and blow some other people up, I think maybe I'll tell the Americans about this. Maybe that person's inclined to do that, except if they're going to kidnap your cousin and torture him, maybe you don't say anything. That's a cost of terror. The cost to our people who we make engage in it, who we let engage in it, it's a huge moral cost. People have written about this. Glenn, blanking on his last name, former Army guy who I've worked with Human Rights First for torture abolition and lobbied on Capitol Hill. He wrote a whole book on this and at least a couple of Washington Post op-eds. He was involved in this stuff when he was in the Army, and it will haunt him till he dies. And that's a cost we're imposing on the troops, all the people we worship as part of our quasi-militaristic religion in America. And yet we're doing this to them. We're inflicting this moral injury upon them, and that is never discussed. So if I can depict those costs of torture, which are nowhere depicted in America's establishment media, then I feel like I'm doing some good. And by the way, along these lines, like one way you can tell when people, in my opinion, are being crazy is this: when they only want to talk about the costs of the policy they don't agree with, and they only want to talk about the benefits of the policy they do agree with, that to me is a form of, well, craziness. I don't know what else to call it.
Or dishonesty.
Yeah, it's right. Assuming if it's being done deliberately, then I would definitely call it dishonesty. But maybe because I have a probably too charitable interpretation of most human behavior, I think it's not intentional. And so like one place you can see this is anytime someone who's in favor of drug prohibition talks about decriminalizing drugs, you will only ever hear them talk about what they think will be the costs. It's going to be nothing but addicts. They won't go to work. They'll just be doing orgies all day, and civilization will collapse. And they never talk about the costs of their own preferred policy, which are, you can't even keep a track of I don't think of the monetary expenditures for law enforcement and judicial and prison facilities, just for the sake of arresting and investigating and prosecuting and then warehousing all the people who might have smoked a joint at some point. And then of course there are border resources, intelligence resources. What are the costs of destabilizing Mexico, our southern neighbor, by fueling, by pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into illegal criminal syndicates? That seems like that's a real cost. What about corruption? There's so much money in this stuff. How much corruption does in America and elsewhere? What do those things cost? What does it cost that our war on some drugs falls most heavily on minority and other marginalized populations in America, who then have members ripped out from their communities and families, and then have to be warehoused by the states, have their lives ruined, become unemployable, they can't vote, they can't work, they got a felony jacket for the rest of their lives. What's the cost of that? Nobody could even add something like that up. It can't be calculated. But proponents of prohibition never talk about that. And that's a form of insanity to me. Torture is one of those other areas where I'm like, you only think that there's a cost to not torturing, and you don't think there's a cost to torture. You're at a minimum, you are severely mentally constipated right now. And we got to find a way to disimpact your brain. Anyway, that's what I try to do with the politics of my books, hopefully in a fictional setting, to just get people to see something differently. They get caught up with the characters, they sympathize with the characters, they relate to them, but the characters are approaching the world in ways that might be different from what these readers would expect the hero to actually do, or the way the hero would actually look at the world. And yet there is that sympathy, that empathy, which has to exist for a novel to work. You have to care about the characters. And so hopefully that empathy with my characters becomes a kind of bridge to help people understand some of the political backstory, the political milieu in these novels, to understand all that in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have understood it if they were viewing it only through their own eyes instead of through the eyes of these characters on the page.
Well, thanks for that answer. And going to, I think, some specific questions about your book specifically. In The God's Eye View, you kind of talk a lot about NSA surveillance, and I'm sure that was inspired a lot by the Snowden, leak and all of the revelations of that.
Yeah.
So I found that it's in some ways easier to keep track of NSA capabilities based on what I know from your book, as opposed to the reporting on the Snowden's leaks, just because a lot of that can be somewhat dry and technical.
Sure.
And do you think that's an advantage of fiction in general?
Yeah, I do. By the way, I should mention, it's funny. I had the idea for God's Eye before June 2013,
Oh, really?
when Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras in The Guardian and Bart Gellman in the Washington Post started reporting on the revelations. But and I was hardly the only person to just be sure that whatever capabilities, whatever programs the public was privy to, had to be the tip of the iceberg for what the NSA was actually doing. And so I started coming up with this idea about, well, what if I had something like this? And my concern was that my idea, which was for something like God's Eye, I thought, yeah, but this is going to be too much. People won't buy it. They'll be like, Barry, there's no way the government has this kind of capability. There are no programs like this. So, and that's something I was grappling with as I was outlining what would become the God's Eye view, because as I mentioned earlier, I want my novels, realism is part of my brand, and I want my novels to be as realistic as possible. So I'm like, is this really too out there? And then the Snowden stories broke, and I realized, oh my God, not only was I contemplating not too far out there, it wasn't out there enough. Reality was actually far more than what I had planned, which was disturbing and also darkly humorous. So I had to up my God's Eye program game in the book just to keep track with what we learned about reality. Anyway, yeah, I think it is an advantage. Any journalist who's reporting on these things will, of course, want lay people to be able to understand what this program is, why is it so dangerous. And that's why when you read articles about NSA bulk surveillance, the NSA is quick to, again, it's like you got to collect all the hay to find the needle. Obama said this, and various intelligence officials have said it over the year. It's like they know it. It's good propaganda. They say, nobody's reading your letter to grandma. That's verbatim Obama. And then it's like, oh, well, okay, that's good. But then think about it. It's almost like an urban legend, which taps into something in our brains. But then when you think about it, you're like, well, wait a minute. Why would there be a guy from an escapee from a mental institution who has a hook for a hand? And I'm like, right at the moment before the boy and the girl got creeped out and drove away, actually had the hook in the car. How was he going to open the car door with a hook anyway? Why wouldn't he have been using his good hand? Like, none of it makes sense, but it takes you a minute to think about it, but it prevents you from thinking about it because it's satisfying something else emotionally in your mind such that you don't want to examine it. By the way, this is how a con works. When my daughter was small, and we periodically review this kind of stuff, like every parent, the nightmare scenario is an abduction or something like that. So, stranger danger, these sorts of things, not the only danger out there, but it's one. And we would talk about, what do you do if some stranger comes up to you and says, hey, your mom and dad told me to take you to the whatever? And I taught her, this is how a con works. A con has to get you moving, not has to, there are exceptions, but this kind of con, got to get you moving fast, get you scared, make you feel like there's no time to think, there's no time to check with anyone. Something in your gut will tell you something's going wrong. A guy named Gavin DeBecker wrote a great book on this called The Gift of Fear. But you're so hopped up that you ignore your gut and you get caught up in the moment. So I said, we practice this stuff. I'm like, what if someone comes to you and says, Emma, your mommy and daddy were in a terrible car accident and the hospital sent me to take you to the hospital. Now, to a 5-year-old, something like that, that's going to be terrifying. She's not thinking now, oh my God, my parents, what? She gets in the car. I'm like, they're trying to get you scared. They're trying to keep it moving. Even if you sense, well, this is weird. Why wouldn't cousin whoever come? Or why wouldn't I be getting a call from uncle whoever? It's some stranger. It doesn't make sense. I said, that will never happen in your life, ever. Or our dog. Oh my God, Emma, the dog was hit by hit by a car and your parents told me to come pick you up. To get you scared and not thinking. I said, that will never, ever happen. No one will ever send someone to pick you up who you don't know. Never happen. So we drill that stuff because I don't want these things to be talismans. People that are like, oh, I'm okay. And I had to talk with my daughter, or I have a gun in the desk drawer and they don't know how to use it or whatever the talisman is. And that doesn't interest me. So that's how a con works. That's how propaganda works. And that's how nobody wants to read your letter to grandma works. it sounds like, oh, I'm comforted now. But then think about it. When was the last time he even wrote grandma? Is grandma even still alive? And and it's like, well, I don't care if they read my letter to grandma anyway, which is what you're supposed to be thinking. All it says is, hey, grandma, I think you're okay. And, like news of the day, the most anodyne thing in the world that they're like, you don't have to worry about that, which you weren't worried about anyway. And then you're like, okay, I guess I'm comforted. And it just, in that moment of comfort, your mind shuts down to all the other possibilities. And this is so good journalists write about those other possibilities to try to engage you on things that you might actually be concerned about. They're like, well, if you look at the way GPS tracking works, or just the way metadata works, like Michael, then director of NSA and CIA, Michael Hayden once said, we kill people based on metadata. And yeah, that's right. The government does do that. So what if your metadata shows that, just as examples, like it can easily, I'm presenting it a little more succinctly even than they do in the articles, but it shows that you made a visit to Planned Parenthood recently, or to to a gay bar, or to like a hotel or something, even though you're married. It's like the middle of the night, you're married, that kind of thing. All sorts of behaviors that people would prefer to maintain, or to a substance abuse meeting or whatever. I mean, you can learn more about people with metadata than you can by listening in on their conversations, at least some of the time. And people don't understand that. So the government says, look, it's just metadata. We don't actually listen to your actual conversations. And people are like, well, what's the big deal with that? So good journalists have been like, here's the problem with that. Here's what the government can actually learn. And yes, I'm definitely trying to do some version of that by taking real programs that are actually deployed, putting them in a dramatic, compelling, fictional context, and then showing people, this is what a program like this is used for. These are the human beings on the other end of this program. They're flawed. They're human. They can't be trusted with power. Humans can't be trusted with power. Not with that, they can be trusted with a certain degree of power, mitigated by transparency and accountability. But without transparency and accountability, power corrupts, as the saying goes. This is just a fact of human nature. It's why we have transparency and accountability. It's why, I think it was James Madison, not Jefferson, said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. Yes, bingo, correct. So to have any humans in charge of the most far-reaching bulk surveillance operation in the history of humankind, something that the East German Stasi couldn't even have dreamed of. They wouldn't have dared to dream of something this vast without a democratic debate, which is what Snowden from the beginning said is what he was trying to foster. He doesn't think these programs are good, but he was like, I'm not trying to torpedo the programs. I'm trying to make people aware of them so that the American public can do some version of informed consent or can vote these programs down. Again, they can't do either one of those things. They can't have a meaningful opinion about any of this if they don't even know the programs exist. So yeah, I'm trying to depict the way these things really work when real human beings have this power in the absence of transparency and accountability. How will these programs inevitably be misused?
Oh, well, thanks for that. So another, going back to one of your protagonists, Ben Trevin, he, at the kind of start of his series, he is very much like a, Vince Flynn or Tom Clancy protagonist in a lot of ways. He's very big into kind of American imperialism.
Yes.
And whereas I think in those authors, they would probably view that worldview uncritically. You kind of, without giving too much away, challenge it a lot, and he undergoes an evolution.
Yeah.
Do you think that was like a conscious reaction to those authors again, or was it sort of organic?
It wasn't conscious, but you never know what, I shouldn't say never. Sometimes I'm aware of what has influenced a character or something like that. Other times not. And in Trevin's case, I don't know what influenced him. Whatever I was doing with him, it wasn't conscious. But you're right. What was fun for me with Trevin is that he has a worldview that is much more of a Mitch Rapp kind of Vince Flynn character worldview than the more realistic, I would call it, other people maybe would call it cynical, worldviews of my other characters. And I like that because I want to be sympathetic, empathetic to my characters. I want to deeply understand them. They don't have to agree with me. That isn't the point. So with Trevin, he just took the shape he took without my thinking, oh, I'm going to have a character who's more typical in his Americanistic outlook. But that's just the way he got, I don't know what to call it exactly, like reared or grew in my mind as I started thinking about him more and more. But I think there were two things that were interesting about him. And again, not intentional, but just the way it presented itself on the page. Trevin would say things that I don't know if like a Vince Flynn character would put it so baldly. Because that's, again, the thing is, this is Reinhold Niebuhr and how the hypocrisy is the tribute the lesser self has to pay to the higher self to get the higher self to engage in enterprises it would otherwise reject. This is the use of euphemisms, like Orwell's great essay, Politics in the English Language. He talks about all this. Like if we use the actual bald-faced accurate terms, people would be revolted. They would turn away in revulsion from these things. But if we talk about rural pacification instead of machine gunning peasants and setting their homes on fire, then, well, rural pacification doesn't call up any imagery in the mind. It doesn't sound so bad. We don't feel any way about it. Go ahead and do it. Trevin was a little more honest than I think your average imperialist mindset would be. There's a chapter in, I think it's the first Trevin book, Fault Line, where, and I don't remember the exact Latin, it's like oderant dem medutunt or something like that. And it means so long as they fear us. And that's his attitude. And he talks about, he knows Americans are hypocritical. He understands that. But he justifies that by saying, everybody's a hypocrite. All the other countries are hypocrites. We're just more powerful. And tough shit. How did we get where we are today? Yeah, we're better at war. We're a warrior people. We conquered the weaker people. And here we are. And I don't care whether anyone else loves us so long as they fear us. I think that's a quote from Caesar, if I'm remembering correctly. And so that is a coherent and widespread, I think, worldview. I don't agree with it. But that isn't the point. The point is there are people who really have that view. Trevin is one of them. And to the extent I tweaked it at all, I made Trevin a little bit more honest about that worldview, which interests me because euphemisms don't interest me unless I'm calling them out. I think euphemisms are intended to prevent us from seeing things clearly. Not every euphemism. I mean, there's, when we talk about, pardon me, can you direct me to the washroom or the, or the WC or whatever, it's fine. Everybody knows what's going on there. You don't want to say, look, I got to take a dump. That's fine. I don't care. Everybody understands. But when you deliberately change the name of the War Department to the Defense Department, that is intended to obscure something. When you have something called the National Security Agency, here's my test. If you ask a 5-year-old, what do you think the police department does? They know, because that's just a thing that is understood by 5-year-olds. What do you think the fire department does? Well, they fight fires. Duh, of course, right? What do you think the National Security Agency does? I guess security? Yeah, but specifically. Could be anything. What government agency isn't, at least to some degree, involved in security? The more accurate name for the National Security Agency would be the National Surveillance Agency. They don't call it that because that make people uptight. And often, actually, you can tell how much of a euphemism is this thing by how much it focuses on the ostensible end rather than on the actual means. So defense, we're like, hey, we're just trying to defend ourselves. That's our objective. Well, how do you do that? Oh, we make war. Oh my God. Okay, I get it. Security through surveillance. Anyway, so euphemisms euphemisms interest me tremendously, but I don't want to traffic in them. And when I use them in my books, it's only so that they can be exposed for what they are. And that's why Trevin, on the one hand, is very much one of those rightist, and I'm not even blaming him for this, it's just we're fed it from the earliest age. He has that imperialistic, typical American establishment worldview, but he's a hardened enough person who's seen enough of the world not to want to hide behind he doesn't need the euphemisms. He knows what it is. And he actually prides himself in that. He gets it. He knows the real deal. It's like history is written in blood. Power is the ultimate. Violence is the ultimate form of communication. And that's the world we live in. And I'm a guy who communicates in violence. And if you have a problem with that? Try to change my mind. And if you're going to change my mind, you better be better at violence than I am. And guess what? I doubt you are, because I'm Ben Trevin. That's how he rolls. But most people wouldn't want to put it quite so baldly because it's a bit distasteful.
Mm-hmm. I guess this is somewhat speculative, but how do you think a conservative reader who maybe isn't aware of your other work would react to Ben Trevin, first reading about him? Do you think they'd admire him, or would they think he's being too bald-faced about it?
I'm not sure. I think overall they'd admire him, because one thing that you can do that's fun in fiction, can function as a kind of wish fulfillment. And I talk about this in the context of my John Rain character from time to time, because John Rain's a contract killer. He's a bad guy. Mm-hmm. Well, why is it that readers love him and sympathize with him, empathize with, even sympathize with him when he's a murderer and a contract killer? And there are a lot of ways you can create that sympathy with a bad character. The Godfather is my text on that, because you could all these same things you could say about Don Vito Corleone. Is a murderer. He's the head of a vast criminal organization. He's by all these metrics, what anyone would agree, he's a bad guy. And yet in Mario Puzo's book, he's not the hero. I mean, the real protagonist is his son, Michael, but he's a good guy. And there are a lot of techniques you can use to make someone who's otherwise bad into the good character in the book. And one of those things, you people the novel with people who are even worse. And then you give your character some redeeming qualities, like the Godfather's extremely loyal to his family, and he's straight-laced about drugs and sex, and honorable in all his business dealings and all these sorts of things. Whereas the people he's surrounded with are all these like whoring politicians who are just so much worse in every way. And so you admire him by comparison. There's that. And the Don has a code, and Rain has a code, and we admire those things. But there's also this element of wish fulfillment at work, which is like, Rain doesn't have to engage in a lot of I'm okay, you're okay, and feel, felt, found, and getting to the negotiations and that sort of thing. Like, who among us has not been irritated by someone who's talking too loudly into a cell phone in an elevator at a restaurant or whatever? And it's always this thing, it's like, do I say something, and then it's uncomfortable, and the person will probably ignore me anyway, and then what do? Do I escalate? And it's just like this whole thing. What do you do about it? And I actually have a scene in one of my short stories, Rain short stories, Paris is a Bitch, where there's a guy at the table who won't stop shouting into his cell phone at the next table in a restaurant. Rain asks him once nicely, and he won't comply. And then Rain becomes, he doesn't actually commit violence until later, but he makes it extremely clear to the guy that was your warning. That was your warning. You don't want to know what happens if you don't close that phone now and put it away. And who among us just doesn't wish that instead of a negotiation where it's like, pardon me, I think it might be the acoustics in here, given that sound travels through oxygen better than it does through the icy vastness of space. It's causing your cell phone conversation voice to reach my table that's 27 feet away. Would it be too much trouble? Could I impose upon you? All that stuff. You don't want to do that. You want to say, would you just shut the fuck up? Who are you screaming into your cell phone in an elevator? Who does that? But we can't do that. But Rain can. And so there's the wish fulfillment. And to that extent, I think any rightist who reads Ben Trevin, there's wish fulfillment. I mean, Trevin is a legitimate badass. He is a tactical and violence expert. There aren't many people on this planet who are better at violence than Trevin. And I think if we're all being honest, unless you really are a hardcore pacifist, which I'm not, and you think violence is irrelevant to, or whatever capacity I might have for violence is irrelevant to me because I will never commit violence under any circumstances ever, that's a very rare person. It's rarer even than the people who claim that mantle, I'm sure. But for anyone who thinks that, yeah, I mean, I might use violence, only in self-defense, or as Jane in Firefly said it, well, I'd kill a man in a fair fight, or if I thought or if I thought he might start a fair fight. It's like one of my favorite quotes ever. Respect Joss Whedon. But if you think, if you'd like to be able to ever just have the ability with violence solely for purposes of self-defense and no more than that, if you're that person, which is 99.999% of humanity, I'm sure, then you read about a guy like Ben Trevin and you can't help but feel like, God, I wish I could do that. I'm sure I never would, except in the most exigent circumstances, but it would be awesome to have that. It would be like having a dragon who's got your back. I would never sick the dragon on anyone, but if you ever really needed that dragon, it would be pretty cool to be able to say, hey, I need your help. And that's Trevin. So yeah, there's definitely wish fulfillment at work there, and probably maybe more so for people who are a little more rah about how America has got the greatest military in the history of mankind and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Which, it's just one more thing about it. Let's go all the way back, and it's short. Have you ever read the lyrics to the Star Spangled Banner?
I don't think so.
I mean, you would love this. Check this out. Google John Schwartz, Jon.
Oh, all right.
And Schwartz with no, it's Schwarz. He writes for The Intercept. So Google John Schwartz, Star Spangled Banner. He wrote a great piece about it a few years ago.
Oh, thanks.
It's really eye-opening because it's only the first stanza that usually, which is bad enough, that gets sung. It's actually a celebration not just of war, but of also of slavery. And what would we say about another country whose national anthem was a celebration of war? I mean, that's just, of all the things we could celebrate about America, I would think, and it's just weird that the one we pick is a celebration of war and also slavery. Besides the fact that the melody's horrible and nobody can even sing the song. That's a subjective thing. But the lyrics are undeniably a celebration of war and slavery. And this is one of those things where we give ourselves a pass. We can't see it in ourselves. If Iran or Russia or China had as its national anthem, I mean, this is like Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles. And we're like, oh my God, those Nazis. You know, and yet we walk around saying American exceptionalism, we're the country that everyone wants to be. Obama literally said that. He took it a step further than most. He said every other country wants to be us. I wrote a blog post about it at the time. I was like, oh my God, this is beyond neurotic now. I mean, what would you do if you knew a person who went around saying, like, Praveen, I think you're pretty cool, but we both know you want to be me. No, it's not that you're jealous. You actually want to be me. You'd be like, yeah, okay, Barry. And you would run away. You'd be like, that guy's, he's crazy. I mean, he's at least badly neurotic. It's sad. Not just that he thinks those things, but he actually says them out loud. Wow, that's America. All that stuff, American exceptionalism and manifest destiny, we're just fed all that stuff. And so it doesn't mean, to us, it's the most natural thing in the world that, well, yeah, when we have sporting events, we have F-14s flying over the stadium. Well, duh. I mean, of course we have fighter jets. I mean, you know, and the crowd's doing a fist bump. And John McCain sings Bomb, Bomb, Bomb Iran when he's running for president. I mean, that's just normal. Can you imagine what would happen if one of the mullahs, which is our metonymy for Iran, the mullahs, if one of them said something like bomb, 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 I'd be like, oh my God, these warlike Iranians, who by the way haven't invaded another country in like 1,000 years, whatever. So the Star Spangled Banner is one of those things that's like that. We can't hear it for what it is. We can't see it the way we would see it if any other country did something like it. In fact, when another country has done something like that, like Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles, we correctly associate it with Nazi imperialism. It's a pretty amazing thing. I'm sorry, this just got me in a talkative mood. I'm sorry. But it goes back to that blind spot, which is I'm like, look, we already have an inclination to give ourselves a pass on all our bad behavior. I don't need to be fed more of that by the New York Times. Not that the New York Times has no value. That's not my point. I'm looking for an alternative. Current affairs would be one. And to the extent I'm able to do something along those lines in my novels, then it's very important for me to do it. I think my novels are entertaining. I hope so. I try to make them entertaining, and the feedback I get suggests that I'm succeeding. And I'm really glad at that, because it's not easy to seduce people out of their everyday lives and get them to care about fake people. You know, it's not, that's a cool magic trick, and it's not easy. And I'm really glad that I'm able to do it. I love reading novels, and so it gives me great satisfaction to be someone who also writes them for the pleasure of other people. But I don't want to just stop there. If there's something else I can do that opens people's minds in a way that my first encounters with the blogosphere 12, 13 years ago, whatever it was, have done for me, and then my subsequent journey into non-establishment media has done for me. If I can do something like that for other people with my novels, then that makes me feel like I've made a pretty good contribution to leaving my campsite better than I found it, as the saying goes, which we should all be trying to do.
Yeah, I just had a couple more questions if you still have time.
Sure.
So I think in one of the emails we had back and forth, you said the right seems to intuitively understand the power of fiction and narrative in a way the left mostly doesn't.
Yes.
But you said with well, I guess first of all, why do you think that might be?
So the evidence I see for it is that the right has been much more deliberate about promoting rightist fiction than the left has ever been, as far as I know. So Glenn Beck, for example, and Rush Limbaugh gave huge platforms to Brad Thor and Vince Flynn, and those guys write they hate us for our freedoms type thrillers. I always feel a little shy about speaking for someone else. I mean, I've met all these people, and I feel like, hey, Brad, if you ever read this interview and I'm not getting your character Scott Horvath quite right, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but I think it's safe to say that these are much more typical American heroes who are acting out and reflecting an Americanistic narrative. And it's not a coincidence that Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck were such big promoters of the books. And then there's take a show like 24, where torture is good. It's very sad and unfortunate that we have to engage in it for the greater good, but the hero has to live with the pain of his blah blah blah. But it's all for the greater good. And you had then Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia was actually citing, not in a case, but in a panel discussion, citing 24 and saying, well, what would Jack Bauer do? I mean, that's tremendously effective shaping of the narrative, propaganda you present it in fiction. And this is to your point earlier, does it get people to look at the world differently when characters they sympathize with do things and believe things? And then does that shape the mind of the reader? Well, we have some evidence for that. It's like for a Supreme Court justice to actually be asking, what would a fictional character do when it comes to torture? That's quite remarkable. So I see the right doing this a fair amount, and there were probably more instances mentioned in that HuffPost article that I emailed you. But I don't. It's of course possible I've missed it, but I don't think I've ever seen the left doing anything comparable. If it's a little bit, and the exceptions I'm aware of have been things I've worked hard to accomplish. Like I've become friendly with Jason Leopold, who at the time was writing A Truth Out, and Jason very kindly hosted a book event I did in Los Angeles years ago for Inside Out, because the book had all the political themes in it. So there've been some instances like that, and I'm really having. Give me 1 second. I hate this. I actually got off coffee recently, and maybe my timing wasn't good with the novel Due When It's Due. Steve Walt is a guy I've met online, gotten friendly with. Steve's a professor of government at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's involved with this organization called the Quincy Institute, which is all about, if you know the Quincy Institute, they're
for responsible statescraft?
Exactly. So the point is really, can we please stop relying on war as a primary instrument of American foreign policy and consider the costs of war and the benefits of alternatives? And I'm really proud to say Steve is a fan of my books, and he brought me out to the Kennedy School for, I think it was the God's Eye View. Yeah, the God's Eye View for a panel discussion, which is really, it was very cool. And so there's some of this, and I don't know that I would describe Steve as left or right. It's, again, he's just someone who I think it's what I was saying before. His politics don't seem like politics to me. They just seem like common sense. Like, can we please discuss the costs of what is often known as imperial overreach? Can we just talk about the costs? Would that be too much to ask? Is that really a left or right position? I guess it is. Anyway, so there've been some instances, but mostly involving efforts and outreach I've made. I don't see the left doing this in any way that's instinctive. It's certainly not any way that's systematic, the way I see it on the right. And I don't much see the effect either. Like I'm waiting for the day when, and again, maybe I've missed it, and I'll be pleasantly surprised if I'm just missing it. But I'd love to hear a Supreme Court justice citing a novel. Maybe it's happened. Maybe like The Jungle gets cited, a political thriller, and it's a classic at this point. But maybe that gets cited and to talk about workers' rights and working conditions and that sort of thing. But the left doesn't really promote fiction in the way the right does. So I see that as a phenomenon. And why would that be? My best guess is that because there's no question in my mind that the right has a better sales game than the left. Not that it's hard. It's classic in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king expression, because the left sucks at narrative. I mean, like remedial level, to the point where I wrote an essay called "The Ass is a Poor Receptacle for the Head: Why Democrats Suck at Communication and How They Could Improve." There are some exceptions to this rule. I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is definitely one of them. She really gets narrative. She's amazing. And I could go on about her. She gets it. She knows, she just instinctively gets it. But most Democrats just don't. And I think the reason, most leftists don't, and I think the reason is that they feel like, yeah, but my product is great. Don't you just want to buy my product? I mean, it's healthcare for everybody. Who wouldn't want that? I don't need to sell this. And it's like, you have to sell everything. Everything needs to be sold. And I used to be a little bit in technology living in Silicon Valley. I was a technology lawyer. And it's this almost a cliche where the engineers come up with cool things that their products can do, speeds and feeds, they call it. And they're like, and the engineers are like, gee whiz, like this one's even more of whatever, or it does this thing. But then it's up to you, but you can't rely on that. Customers don't relate to that. Then it's up to marketing people with an instinct for marketing, to translate those speeds and feeds into real world benefits that will emotionally resonate with a customer. You have to have that game. Like, I still remember this from 20 years ago, the original iPod. Apple had billboards, certainly here in the Bay Area. I don't know about elsewhere, but when they rolled out that product could actually do a lot of things. You could use it as a backup drive, and there were some other things it could do, but they didn't market any of that. They didn't say, oh, it's this, it's that. This was their advertising campaign, 1,000 songs in your pocket, which 20 years later sounds like, what do you mean? Like, that's, isn't it a million? Isn't it Spotify? Whatever. But at the time, it was groundbreaking. Nobody could, at the time, it was Sony Walkman. It was a CD player, maybe, so you could have 20 songs maybe in your pocket. Or you could have another 5 or 6 CDs, or your glove compartment would jam with 1,000 songs in your pocket. So smart. That enormous number in a small personal space. Huge amount of thought went into selling this thing. And I'm not trying to put down the Apple engineers. Maybe they came up with the slogan, but the point is, nobody said, oh, we're going to talk speeds and feeds. So like, how can we communicate this in a way that will make people emotionally want to buy that thing, connect to it in some way? That's marketing. Democrats suck at that. And that's why they called what should have been called, and now is being called. And I would say this is not retroactive. I call this out specifically in that essay, The Ass is a Poor Receptacle for the Head, where I use Obamacare as a case study. I said it should have been called Medicare for All, or the Medicare Extension Act, because this is the process of learning for all humans. You have to take something that's new and unfamiliar and attach it to something existing and familiar. We all do this instinctively. This is where the cliche, it comes like chicken, it tastes like chicken, comes from. So we were like, oh, I ate rattlesnake once when I was in Arizona. People, what does it taste like? Well, have you ever had barbecue chicken? It's kind of like that, but a little tougher, or whatever. We instinctively relate it to something you know. Everybody loves Medicare, to the point where maybe this is apocryphal, or these photos have been digitally altered, but they're funny. And like apocryphal things, they seem to speak to a truth, even if they are not themselves literally true. It's photos of rightists in political rallies with signs that say, government, hands off my Medicare.
Yeah.
So really, most people don't know about it. It's an incredibly popular program in America. To the extent people know it comes from the government, they don't have a problem with it, or they don't even know. So, hey, do you want to roll out something that is nothing more than it is actually a Medicare Extension Act? In fact, the architects of Medicare during the Johnson administration had intended Medicare to be for everyone, but they started with something less ambitious that they thought would be an easier sell, having to do, like, there was Medicaid for poor people, and Medicare was for older people. Like, who can deny senior citizens and the poor some access to Medicare? Like, that's just harder for the right to oppose. So we'll start with that, and then we'll expand. It was supposed to expand by design from the beginning. People know what it is now, so call this is the extension program of the thing you love. That's marketing. Instead, what did Democrats call it? They called it the Affordable Care Act, but it was known as a generic, and Obamacare, but it became known as Obamacare, but it was known as a generic as healthcare reform.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a galactic self-own, because first of all, it wasn't healthcare reform. It wasn't about healthcare. It was about health insurance. I mean, this is enough to get you to start believing in conspiracies, honestly, at least for me, because how could anyone, even Democrats, be this incompetent? You're calling it something that it isn't. That takes effort. Euphemisms take effort. We instinctively call things by, the most obvious thing, which is what they are, what they do. This is about health insurance reform. You won't be getting your health insurance from a private company anymore. The government will provide you with your health insurance, and then you can get the same kind of health care you've been getting already. You go to a doctor, it's private health care. It's just like we have fire insurance now. And if your house catches fire, the government, it's not like whatever it is, the fire department that already exists comes to put out the fire. Whether or not you have fire insurance has no effect on who will be putting out the fire. True also for government provided health insurance. Doesn't affect who will be providing or how you will be receiving your medical care, your health care. And yet, for reasons that I don't really understand, incompetence would be the kindest explanation, the Obama administration billed this as health care reform. I'm thinking of another thing. Healthcare, that's very private and personal to me. I mean, do I want you monkeying with my healthcare? That's like my body and my patient. I mean, it's very personal, private stuff. Whereas everybody I know hates their health insurance, or at least 99 out of 100 people. A few people probably like their health insurance. I don't like mine. It's just universally loathed. So you're already off to a hard start saying, hi, the thing that's very personal with you, I'd like to interfere with that. Are you okay with that? You're like this. Hi, that thing you hate? We'd like to talk with you about how we can make it better. And it's not even personal to you. It's just insurance. What's a person going to say? Sure, I'm listening. How could you miss an opportunity like that? It's because Democrats just suck at that stuff. I don't know. Not conspiracy theory. When the Affordable Care Act passed, the following day, private health insurance company stocks went up by some significant amount. I think it was 5%.
Mm-hmm.
What people don't understand is that the establishment Democrat game is this. You make pretty speeches to the voters, and then you wink at your real constituents, which is money, corporations. So the corporations understand you're just saying what needs to be said for the voters, so they'll vote for you. But don't worry, people. I've got your back when we actually implement this thing. And Obama was a great politician, so he was great at doing that. And I think that's what was going on there. They really weren't trying so hard to sell anything. It certainly wasn't particularly ambitious in the beginning. It was mostly just the Heritage Foundation's version of healthcare, what Mitt Romney passed in Massachusetts when he was governor there. And they just weren't trying to sell it. I mean, they call it single payer. What's single payer? Who knows what single payer is if you're not some sort of policy wonk? It might even be bad. Am I the single payer? Am I going to have to pay? It's like, Barry, let's go out to dinner. There'll be a single payer. I'm like, wait a minute. This is Democrats trying to market. It's amazing. But then when they don't get everything they want, or if they fail entirely, then they say to the voters, it was the mean Republicans, Mitch McConnell, please give me money so I can fight Mitch McConnell, while winking at the private industry who knew all along that there was never really going to be anything other than cosmetic done here. That's the game. So, but Republicans are usually trying to sell something terrible, like taking away a modest extension of healthcare benefits. Or privatizing Social Security. I mean, these are like, how do you sell shit like that? Like, I'm genuinely curious. And Steve Martin had a short story called The Cruel Shoes. And they were like both left feet, and one of them attached with a razor blade device. They were both too small, like this whole thing. And yet the salesman, Carlos, is able to sell this incredibly painful shoe. So it can be done, I guess. But if you're going to sell the cruel shoes, which is what the Republican Party is all about, at its best, really, this is when the GOP is not in full-blown nihilistic death cult mode. They just understand, how are we going to sell people that they shouldn't have government-provided health insurance? Their sales game, their marketing game has to be stellar, and in many ways it is. Think death panels.
Oh, yeah.
Single payer went up against death panels. What do you see when I say single payer? Nothing. It's like Orwell again, rural pacification. What do you see? Nothing. It's meaningless. the Republican rejoinder was death panels. And you see something when someone says death panel. You see a raised dais and a bunch of old people, judges in black robes, maybe looking down at you unforgivingly, like something from Kafka's The Trial, this bureaucratic thing where there's no humanity, nobody's listening to you. And they're just like, no, you will have to die. Your parent, your sibling, your child can't afford it, has to die, which is hilarious because that's what the Republican Party is now doing in the midst of the pandemic.
And the insurance companies to begin with.
Yes, that's right. So there's irony, as bitter as it is in all of this. But again, just looking at it as a tactical marketing and sales game, the Republican rejoinder was genius. Death panels and things that emotionally resonate, things that you can see in your mind. They defeat logic and dry, wonky descriptions every time. It's a totally unequal fight. When Condoleezza Rice said on all the Sunday morning shows after 9/11 and in the lead up to our invasion of Iraq, the second invasion of Iraq. By the way, I'm sorry, I meant to say intervention. We don't actually invade the country. We just intervene, which is great propaganda too, right? Like, what's an intervention? My friend is, he's been drinking too much, and I and his family and all our friends, we're going to do an intervention to help him. We're going to sit him down and be really honest with him to help get him off his dangerous behavior he's engaging in. So that's what the Western wars are not wars. They're just friendly interventions to help countries. Like we intervened in Libya in 2011 and in Iraq for the second time in 2003. But anyway, Condoleezza Rice, what she said is, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. And I got to say, I heard that and I was like, that's going to seal the deal. People aren't going to think, they're going to see it. Smoking gun, mushroom cloud, America, mushroom cloud, don't. Actually, that mushroom cloud takes you back to Lyndon Johnson's 1964 campaign against Barry Goldwater, the famous Daisy ad.
Oh, yeah.
Girl. What does it actually mean? I mean, there's not really any logic to it or anything. It's a little girl picking daisies in a fucking mushroom cloud. Can't get that out of your mind. And you associate that with Barry Goldwater. Done. James Woolsey, former CIA, testifying, or maybe he was CIA, now he's former CIA, maybe he was CIA at the time, yeah, under Bill Clinton, when people were hoping we'd get the so-called peace dividend from the end of the Cold War. What that turned out to mean, again, because we're really ruled by a single party with two different wings that disagree on relatively minor matters, the question was, the peace dividend, will we slow the growth of military spending or just leave it the way we'll leave the growth the way it's always been, but it's going to keep growing. It's not like we're going to cut it back. That's not on the table. Anyway, Woolsey said in his congressional testimony, with the Cold War over, we have slain a mighty dragon, but we find ourselves in a jungle filled with poisonous snakes. And again, I was like, respect, just tactical respect. You can't get that image out of your mind. It's a dead dragon over here, guy with a sword, like, yeah, you know, it's Miller time, except then you look and you're surrounded by vipers. Now is no time to relax. It's genius. Democrats suck at this stuff. I mean, I'm just a guy and I'm far better at this stuff than the people whose job it is to actually sell these policies. So anyway, that's why hopefully AOC will develop a greater and greater voice, influence, and power within the Democratic establishment. Hopefully the Democratic Party establishment will ultimately be displaced because it badly needs to be. It's incredibly self-interested, sclerotic. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make a political speech, but I don't know how anybody who's not part of that machine could see it otherwise. I mean, Matt Iglesias wrote an article after the 2016 presidential election, which Glenn Greenwald likes to taunt Matt Iglesias by repeatedly citing on Twitter. And the headline is, the Democratic Party is a smoking pile of rubble. And he's right. He's not just talking about presidential elections. He looks at losses in Congress and the Senate. And then even more tellingly, he looks at the 20-year rate of losses in state legislatures and gubernatorial races. And Iglesias's headline was just perfect. Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic establishment have presided over a 20-year cataclysm for Democratic establishment, Democratic electoral politics. They need to go. I mean, if they were the coach of a football team, they all would have been pushed out by now. If they were generals in a war, they would have all been replaced. If they were an air traffic controller and it crashed this many airplanes, they would never have gotten near this many airplanes, or a surgeon who would kill this many patients. It's like, please, you're not qualified. Just go be with your grandchildren or retire. It's okay. but power clings to power.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so hopefully we'll have a new breed coming up. Bernie was a pretty good salesman too, by the way, and so it's clearly not just age or generation dependent. But anyway, I don't even remember what we were talking about. I'm sorry, but it was about
That's
lying.
right.
Yeah, so Republicans, I think, are better salespeople than Democrats because, by God, they need to be. They're selling a shit sandwich, and they know they're selling the cruel shoes. And if you're going to sell the cruel shoes with those razor blade clamps, you better have an A+ sales game, and they do.
Mm-hmm. So I think one thing the left sometimes gets criticized for is, especially in regards to fiction, being too as willing to castigate things that people enjoy, and maybe that's counterproductive. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if there are people who really love Tom Clancy books and maybe aren't thinking critically about the political narratives that they feed, is there a way for the left to maybe challenge those narratives without making the person feel like, oh, you're a bad person for liking those books, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's another great question. It's funny, just like 2 nights ago, I don't know if you know Brianna Joy Gray.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she's great. And actually, is she back at Current Affairs now, or am I mixing?
Yeah, I think she started.
There's another Brianna there, Brianna.
Renix.
Renix, thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny. I just read her new article, and I forgot what it was. She's got the first article on the current issue. What the hell was it about? It doesn't matter. Anyway, now it's gonna bug me. But see, I shouldn't have gotten off coffee. but anyway, so just I think it was 2 nights ago on Twitter. Brianna Joy Gray was saying that she doesn't like the movie Blade Runner, and her reasons for not liking it had to do with the fact that characters were doing things that made no sense, which for me is the kiss of death in a story, but also with the politics, and those two things overlapped. And the reactions to me were so weird. By the way, I love that movie. She was not, in my opinion, her criticisms were accurate. You know, a lot of this stuff is subjective, but everything she said, I thought, yeah, you know what, I got to agree with you on that. But for just reasons that aren't really logical, I love, despite all its failings, I love that movie. And I would have no trouble engaging with someone like Brianna, or with my good friend novelist Joe Conrath, who hates Blade Runner. I don't have trouble engaging people about these things because a lot of it is subjective, and people have different reasons for liking or not liking a book or a movie, a story, a song, whatever. And in this case, yeah, I mean, I agreed with Brianna's political critique. I happen to love the movie despite its politics, and even more so despite the fact that it's true, the thing is a mess. There's a funny YouTube channel called CineSins, like Cinema Sins, CineSins, and they do this thing that's like everything wrong about X movie in 17 minutes or less. And they've got one about Blade Runner, and it's hilarious. If you watch it, there's almost no denying it. There are a few things I'd quibble about, but I was like, yeah, you're right. I still love it. And that's totally cool. That's the way we should be able to respect people who either like or don't like what we like or don't like, and, you know, be able to exchange our reasoning and recognize that we're wired differently and weight different factors differently. So when it comes to Tom Clancy or something like that, I was never a Clancy fan, but it wasn't his politics. I tried my first Tom Clancy book, I think I was in high school, and it was Red Storm Rising. And I found it incredibly ponderous. And I'm really not trying to put down Tom Clancy as an author. I don't think if he were still here, he wouldn't give a shit, I presume, about my opinion about his books. So it hasn't, but still, I just like to be clear in saying, like, it doesn't ever give me pleasure to say, well, I didn't like this. I'm not trying to put anyone down. I'm not trying to influence anybody's decision in a context like this. And it doesn't matter anyway, because for God's sake, he's Tom Clancy, and posthumously he sells, I don't even know how many books, and he's got ghostwriters, and his name goes on as the brand name, and it's a franchise. So Tom Clancy did very well for himself and his family, and people love his books, and you can't quarrel with that. It's great to love books. But my reasons for not enjoying Red Storm Rising weren't the politics. I just found it was just ponderously written for me. I mean, for other people, it might have been a page turner, and apparently it was. But to the extent that I have a political disagreement or any disagreement about a book, it wouldn't occur to me to try to persuade someone that I'm right about the book. I'm right to dislike it, and they're wrong to like it. Like, that would be crazy. And so how do you engage someone who likes political or novels that have political narratives you don't approve of? The first thing you got to do is absolutely understand that their enjoyment of that novel is absolutely valid, and that trying to change their mind about it is very similar to trying to persuade someone who doesn't enjoy a food that you enjoy. Like, we would never do that. I personally hate Brussels sprouts. But Praveen, if you told me right now that, damn, Barry, I love Brussels sprouts, it's my favorite food, it would never occur to me to say, Praveen, you're crazy, you're wrong. Brussels sprouts are bad. They taste bad, Praveen. How can you possibly enjoy that miserable food? That you'd be like, he's crazy. You'd think I'm crazy. And there's a line in the movie version of High Fidelity where I forget the actor's name. He's the thin, bald guy in the record store who Jack Black is all aggressive, and he goes, Jack Black says to him, well, what are you listening to now? What do you like now? And the guy says, well, I like the new Bell and Sebastian. And Jack Black says, bullshit. And John Cusack says, how can it be bullshit to express a preference? And that to me sums up so much of what is weird and wrong about humanity. So if somebody loves Tom Clancy or doesn't like Blade Runner or whatever, and I don't agree with the outcome, which is they liked it or they didn't like it, it doesn't really occur to me that I should try to persuade them that their opinion is wrong. I would love to have an open conversation about what struck you about the book. What do you like about it? What didn't you like about it? What was strong? What was weak? And to be able to say, for example, that, like if again, the politics weren't what turned me off to Tom Clancy, but if that was the problem, then I would like to be able to say, yeah, they weren't for me, that I couldn't get past the politics, which were very much blah, blah, blah. But people, that's the way to have a conversation. People don't feel threatened by it. You're not telling them they're wrong. I try to have all my political conversations like this, going back to what I said about socialism. I don't start by saying, free college education should be a right, and it should be universal in America. Who's that going to persuade? I'm not going to persuade the unpersuaded. I doubt it. Instead, I ask the question with a sincerely undecided mind myself. I do have an opinion about this. I do think college education should be universal, just like K through 12. But and I'll acknowledge that for anyone who wants to know. But I don't want to be dogmatic about it. I'm like, but if I'm missing something, then please tell me. There could be lots of things. I'm no education expert. I do know that we think K through 12 public is good, college bad. So what's the difference? I'm sincerely asking, and if I learn something, I'll be like, oh wow, I didn't realize that. Thank you. Let's talk about all the costs and benefits. It should be the same thing. We should be able to have the same kind of conversation in novels. And I'll tell you something that was hilarious for me, and it was one of those aha moments from maybe a year or so ago. My then new novel, Killer Collective, was killing it. It was at the top of the Amazon charts, and it did really well. Did you read that one, by the way?
Oh yeah, and
thank you.
And that's where kind of all three of your protagonists sort of meet each other. Yeah, that was
the big mashup, and so far that's been my most popular book, and at least within the time frame after publication. But anyway, at some point I read an Amazon review, which I generally do. I mean, I stop after, I don't know, 100 or maybe a few hundred, because you don't really learn anything new. But this is actually relates to what we're talking about. People will sometimes say harsh things. Most of my reviews are quite positive, I'm glad to say, but occasionally I get a harsh one. And I try not to let my ego screen out the substance by, like, I don't have to listen to that. He's insulting me. I'm like, I try to ask myself, how would this person have put it if he were giving you the polite version of what he actually said? And can I learn anything from that? So I try to do that exercise. But I'm human, and sometimes I get defensive. And the only time I find that I get defensive, at least initially, my feeling, it's not like I respond, but is when I feel like someone's gotten something wrong in an objective sense. Like if you just wrote, this book sucked 1 star, that doesn't bother me at all. I'm like, it wasn't for you. No book is for everyone. It's totally cool. I mean, really, I don't even feel defensive. I feel like, that's beautiful. Thank you for trying it. I really appreciate that you tried it. But in this case, I saw this review, and this guy said, it was whatever he said. They didn't hate the book. We didn't like it. He's like, the characters are never in danger and nothing ever goes wrong for them. And my immediate reaction was like, wait, what are you talking about? What about that helicopter attack? And, they're taking fire, and Rain he can't hit the helicopter. Nothing's working, and they almost die. And then they finally they're able to shoot down the helicopter. Like, that didn't just go smoothly, like, 1 shot below the helicopter Rambo throwing the rock in First Blood. No. And I was like, and they never face any danger. I killed one of my series characters off. He died in this book. What do you mean they didn't face any danger? So my feeling was like, you're wrong. And then I started thinking about it, and I laughed at myself, because I was like, what are you going to convince this person? Are you going to be like, Bob, I just want you to know that as a matter of fact, my characters did face difficulty and danger in the book. And so you're wrong when you say you didn't like the book. You actually enjoyed it. You just didn't realize it. I'm like, that's the most pathetic, narcissistic thing in the world. And then I started thinking about it, and I was like, whoa, I always thought books, like matters of taste when it came to books, were different from matters of taste in, say, cooking and food. But then I realized they're really not. We think they are because we have a little bit more apparent evidence to resort to when it comes to books. We could say we didn't like the politics, or we didn't like the prose. And it's not that there's not, I mean, there will be reasons that we might be able to articulate, and that might even be accurate reasons. But what no one's ever going to change is your opinion. Your opinion will have to change of itself. You'll come back to something later and look at it in a new light. That's happened to all of us. But you'll never have a conversation with someone right then and there who says, no, Praveen, you actually enjoyed that book. You're wrong when you say you didn't enjoy it, because your articulated reasons were wrong. Therefore, your conclusion must also be wrong. That's just not a thing any more than it is if you were to say, if I served you some soup and you said, whoa, this isn't for me, it's too salty. What if I would then say to you, Praveen, I didn't add any salt at all to that soup? You wouldn't go like, oh, fuck me, it's delicious. It's not a thing. It wouldn't happen. You would say, okay, it wasn't the salt, but I didn't like it. I still don't like your soup. And it's like that with books too. And so I think you have to keep all those things in mind if you're going to be able to discuss anything, certainly books, about which you and someone else don't see eye to eye. And those are, of course, the most important conversations we can be having as a society. So it's vitally important that we try to get them as right and productive as we possibly can, such that even at the end of the conversation, when we don't agree about the conclusion, we respect each other and we feel like we're still cohesive members of a society, of the human race, whatever. And everyone who has responded to Brianna the other night, it's just funny that that just happened because it turns out to be such an interesting case study. They were all responding in what I consider to be the wrong way. And what I mean by that is they were telling her she's wrong, that it's a great movie. I'm like, why? It just doesn't make any sense. I actually agree with her reasons, even though I don't agree with her conclusion, but that's not even the point. It's like, she didn't like the movie. Okay. Now what you have to say is, let's talk about why you didn't like it and I liked it. And it should be an interesting conversation. Very interesting. Get someone else's perspective. You'll see things that you didn't see. By the way, she saw things that I didn't see. They didn't change my mind. I still love that movie. I can't help it. But I was like, oh, I hadn't even spotted that. That's a good point. And so I already have tremendous respect for Brianna, but at the end of the conversation, I had no less respect for her, more, if anything, even though I didn't agree with her conclusion. And I'm not saying that should be like the actual goal of every conversation. There are all sorts of conversations, but come on, anyone who's been on Twitter, mostly it's just a giant "you're wrong" machine. It's just a giant self-pleasure machine, self-pleasure achieved through denunciation, outrage, and proving that the other person was wrong in the most, even if it's only in the most marginal sense possible, that really has little or nothing to do with the substance of whatever the person said. Like, that's Twitter, which is why I find it so, mostly as a medium, so distasteful and a waste. But other than learning certain things about human nature, you can do that on Twitter. But I think I've learned about as much as I care to at this point. Anyway, so that's the kind of conversation you have about a book. It was, instead of saying, hey, Brianna, to just use this real world recent example about a movie, instead of saying you're wrong, you should consider the person's reasons. Maybe there's something to them, even though, and then you can say, I see where you're coming from. I got to admit, the politics don't matter to me the way they matter to you, or I see the politics differently than you did, or that thing, which it's funny that she called. Do you know Blade Runner? Have you seen it?
I've seen it, yeah.
I actually said it. We rewatched it not that long ago, maybe 6 months ago, and the love scene with Harrison Ford and Sean Young. I was saying to Laura, I'm like, he's raping her. It's date rape. She's trying to leave. He's physically keeping her from leaving the apartment. And I'll admit, I was being partly facetious because in the context of the movie, it certainly isn't intended that way. But by current prevailing standards, it's impossible to recognize. Like if you just described it, forget about the movie with whatever context of the time and the cinematography and the, all that stuff, take that out. If you just said to pretty much anyone today, a woman's in a man's apartment and she becomes uncomfortable and he's making advances at her, he's trying to kiss her, and she tries to leave. She goes to the door and he bangs the door shut with his fist and pursues her back into the room until she's backed up against the blinds and says, "Kiss me." Say whatever he says, like, say, "Kiss me." He's making her say shit. People be like, "Holy shit, no, that's all wrong." So Brianna's not wrong. You can see it differently in context. I think it's legitimate to say the movie came out in, I think it was 1982. There was a different ethos at the time. You have to take that into account. And you can also, I think, legitimately account for everything that was portrayed for context in the movie. I'm not suggesting one or the other conclusion. I'm saying this could be a discussion about this scene in this movie. But I totally respected where Brianna was coming from. In fact, I made the same comment to my wife when we were watching it. So that's the way you have to be able to talk about it. It's not like, Brianna, you're wrong. It's, I see what you mean. I happen to see it, this scene in this movie, a little differently, even though I agree with you at a higher level. And here's why. And then you can talk and you can learn things from each other, hopefully. And again, even if you don't agree at the end, you can shake hands, not literally these days, but you can do a sampeya or a bow or whatever on a Zoom call, and part feeling like you have more in common than you have apart. And that's, I think, very important for a society. These days we're having millions of micro conversations, the net result of which I think is othering people we disagree with. And I think it's dangerous. So, which is really interesting. So I complain about the state of primary education, that we're taught all sorts of things that, and this may be narcissistic because I don't remember anything more than fourth grade math. I'm terrible. I stopped being able to help my daughter, I think when she was in third grade, when it came to math. Writing, I've been very helpful about. I'm glad to say, essays and things like that. But math, no. So none of that stuff has had much of an impact in my life. And yet it was taught to me ruthlessly all the way through 12th grade. And what wasn't taught to me? Engines, basic repairs, electricity, heating, cooling, plumbing, the way things work. I mean, the way things work in our world, to me, is almost, for most things, indistinguishable from magic. I'm a decent handyman for some things, but really, like, I walk down the street and I look at things and I'm like, what is that thing? What does it do? How does it work? And I don't have answers. I'd be pretty useless in a grid down situation. And I'm not happy about that. We don't have a very resilient society. The pandemic is proving that. Anyone who's paying attention already knew that. But even think about the notion of the grid, the electricity grid, instead of, say, solar panels on individual houses or distributed wind farms or anything like that. Like, it wouldn't be as much of a calamity if there's some sort of outage of any kind, if it were distributed. And it wouldn't be as much of an emergency if there's a grid down situation because of a hurricane or an earthquake or whatever, if people were more prepared, both by having provisions on hand, but that's a personal choice people have to make right now, but also just with know-how. Like, if the electricity goes out, I'm not going to be able to help. If the plumbing's not working, it's unfortunate, but I'm not the guy to turn to. I can help with some things, but not others. I was never taught CPR in school. Everybody should know these things. Everybody should know these things, and then you can learn trigonometry. But we do the opposite. The basic stuff you have to learn on your own, or hopefully you've got a parent who's handy, or you took wood shop or something like that when you were in high school. It was available, but it's certainly not on the required curriculum. And I think that's unfortunate. And one thing that I think is missing from that core curriculum is just communication. Like, it is so much more important for a society that we be able to engage with each other than that we all learn trigonometry. I don't even know what trigonometry is, by the way. I'm not saying it's not important. I doubt that people could build bridges or spacecraft without it. I'm sure there are really like I'm sure someone here would overhearing this would say, Barry, don't be an ignoramus. You don't like trigonometry? Let me tell you right now, there's no Golden Gate Bridge without your trigonometry. So you're stuck, you know, you're not gonna, whatever. And I'm not saying that, I get that. I know it's critical for all sorts of elements of modern living. What I'm saying is, it is only critical that a very small percentage of the population become expert in it, because only a small percent of the population is going to use it in the end. Whereas these other things I'm talking about, we all engage with each other. It's virtually impossible to avoid engaging people in this world who have a different worldview than ours. And being able to engage those people is a critical skill for everyone, other than a critical skill that only a small group of people need to understand. I mean, like, brain surgery is a critical skill. I wouldn't want to live in a society that didn't have brain surgeons, but come on, not everybody has to be a literal brain surgeon. So that's the way I look at this kind of, how can you engage people in a productive way? And how much evidence do you see of productive engagement on social media?
Yeah, very little.
Is it 0.01%? Maybe. It's very little. And that's bad. That's dangerous. So I think we have our priorities wrong, and that's something that it can be taught and it should be taught, but it has to become a priority, and it just isn't. It's one of those critical skills that we leave people to learn from, hopefully from their parents, or somehow to stumble upon one way or another themselves. Like, they'll hear about how to win friends and influence people and give it a try. By the way, that book is fantastic. People think it's cheesy because the title's a little cheesy. Fine. Read the damn book. It is a beautiful philosophy about how to get what you want by getting the other person what the other person wants, and by engaging people in a positive way that reaches out to what is best in those other people, what makes them feel good about themselves, instead of by trying to motivate people by fear or punishment or other negative means. It's actually a beautiful book with, a title that's become a little hoary and cheesy maybe with the passage of time. But that's the kind of thing I stumbled upon myself, I don't know, like 20 years ago or longer. It wasn't taught in school. It's too bad.
So one of your protagonists is a Seattle sex crimes detective.
Yeah.
And, now there's a massive, protests against police brutality and kind of a renewed conversation of the role of the police. Have you gotten any pushback from the left about those books, or have you reconsidered how you write about the police?
No, it's a great question. I don't know if I'll get pushback. There are areas where I've sometimes thought I'll probably get pushback because of the zeitgeist, and it hasn't really happened. What I would say to anyone who, I'm trying to think of what, it's not exactly disagrees with, but rather, for whatever reason, doesn't like my portrayal of Livia Lone, who is a sex crimes detective in Seattle. That's her job. And I portray her in, I would not say an exclusively positive light, like my other characters. She's twisted. Livy's a person who was twisted by trauma. The way I sum her up is to say, I like this, like many things, this is an oversimplification, but I think it's eye-opening and useful to consider this saying that there are three kinds of people. The majority of people are sheep. They're good, gentle creatures that they would never harm anyone. They just want to be left alone, eat the grass, be in the sunshine, live their lives. They would never hurt a soul. But then there's another kind of creature, and that's the wolf. And wolves prey on the sheep. And that's a very small percentage of the population, but they do a lot of damage to the sheep. But then there's a third class of person, and that class is the sheepdog, which has fangs like wolves, but rather than an instinct for predation, has an instinct for protection. And I believe in that analogy. I believe it's accurate. Of course, it's oversimplified. But in my experience in the world, it's been my privilege to know some very good cops and to be grateful to them for what they do. They exist. And although my novels are political, they're not intended to make, or they're certainly not exclusively intended to make a political point. I'm portraying Livia as accurately and compellingly in me on the side of, I do not think that those two things are at all antithetical.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's unrealistic to create a character with those qualities. I don't think it's unrealistic to create a cop who's devoted to justice, even albeit in Livia's occasionally twisted way. But even when Livia isn't acting outside the law to get what she considers to be justice, she feels her victim's trauma as acutely as she feels her own. And there are cops like that. I've met them. So I'll give you one other different kind of political example. In one of my books, one of my characters is faced with an unwanted pregnancy, an unexpected pregnancy, and is torn, as someone in that position naturally will be. And she seriously considers getting an abortion, but in the end, she decides not to. And later, when she's holding this infant, she looks back and is horrified that she ever considered aborting it. And I've gotten some angry mail over the years about that. And I've always responded to those letters in exactly the way we've been talking about. How do you respond? It's not, you're wrong. I understand where they're coming from. I'm very much in favor of all full women's reproductive rights, of a woman's right to choose, of a woman's easy, affordable access to all forms of reproductive care. It's a no-brainer for me. Even though, I said it's a no-brainer, I actually understand where the other side is coming from. I do. I don't think it's crazy. When I have this argument with people, what I say is, this is the way I look at it. I'm very much pro-choice. But I don't think anybody would argue that, to use an extreme example, the moment like the baby's crowning, you can still get an abortion. I don't know anyone who would say, no. Like, okay, we've said that there's a certain point where the balance of the mother's rights and the baby's rights have shifted, and now we have to protect the baby's rights. And I don't know anyone who would say, hey, it's totally fine. Baby's crowning, go ahead and abort it. Nobody would say that. But similarly, I can't help, my feeling is, when you're talking about two germ cells, that's not a baby. It's all about the woman's rights there. And at some point, as Roe v. Wade tried to get this difficult question right, at some point, gradually, the rights in question are going to shift all the way from it's all about the woman to now it's all about the baby. At some point, that's going to happen, to use extreme ends of the continuum to make that point. And now we're just in the very difficult land of trying to determine along that spectrum, what are the different points and what are the implications? And I don't know the answer to that necessarily. But my point is, I can listen to someone who's very much against abortion without treating them like a religious zealot or they're crazy or something like that. And I think that's important. But as it happens, I think is about as pro-choice as a person could be. But in that scene with this character, being as true to this character as I could be, knowing her as well as I've tried to know her, as I try to know all my characters, that is how she felt in that moment. Looking at her previous grappling with the decision of whether to get an abortion or go ahead with the pregnancy, when she looked back on that, and she was horrified that she had considered aborting the baby. Now, I am equally confident, like this is one instance of a full range of human possibilities in a moment like this, in a circumstance like this. I'm sure there are women who have had the baby and regretted it instead of being glad that they didn't get the abortion. I'm sure, every possible articulation of this situation, of course it's happened. Humans are complicated, and this situation is incredibly complicated. There are probably women who've gotten abortions and regretted it. And there are women, I know there are women who've gotten abortions and been incredibly relieved. These are all human possibilities. They are real and they exist. And for this character, I chose the one that felt real to me for that character. I was not trying to make a political point. I was trying to be true to the character. And that's what I've tried to explain when people have complained about that scene. that is how I would respond to anyone who would think to complain that I've created an honest, diligent, justice determined cop. I, I, there's this saying that attributed to Samuel Goldwyn, I think, if you want to send a message, use Western Union. And that's right. It's not that there's not going to be any sort of message in fiction. There is, obviously, all the time. We can call those things themes. They're not messages as so much as when they're done right, they become themes that make you feel differently about something, and therefore think about it differently. So there are certainly themes in my novels, but they're not all about making narrow political points. That would suck. I mean, that's what a blog post is for. I have to be true to my characters, or no one's novels will work if the characters aren't true. So I'm not thinking, oh, I'm pro-choice. I can't have a character who looks back and says, wow, I can't believe I even thought about aborting my beautiful baby. I'm not writing something in favor or against pro-choice or choice in this novel. I'm writing about a certain character. And I think if you don't want to do that, then you should reconsider whether you want to be in the storytelling business. You might be great in the policy writing business, the journalism business, whatever. Write nonfiction books, absolutely. Those are critically important. But you're going to have a hard time being true to your characters if you constrain their human behavior, their human choices and human worldviews, and confine them only within the narrow, if you think about it, extremely narrow confines of your own politics. And so Livia is who she is to me. I gave a huge amount of thought to who she is and where she came from. I did a tremendous amount of research for that character, including attending conferences on child abuse and human trafficking, traveling to Thailand, as I do for on-site research. I read articles, books. I did ride-alongs and interviews with Seattle police. I did everything I possibly can to make Livia as real and compelling and sympathetic a character as I possibly could. I believe there are people like Livia, and she interests me. So I don't really know how you could complain about her in a political sense, because she's not intended to make a political statement. It would be like criticizing my books for not having enough musical numbers in them. They're not musicals. Or criticizing them for not being funny enough, although there are some scenes that I'm glad to say have provoked hilarity occasionally from feedback I've gotten from readers, and that's delightful, because it's a great feeling to be able to make someone laugh. But they're not comedies. They have comic moments sometimes. So if someone were to criticize my books for not being funny enough, I would say that's not what I'm trying to do. That's not really. I don't want to say that any criticism is like ipso facto illegitimate. You can criticize anything you want to criticize it for, but I feel like, like criticizing one of my books for not fitting your foot right, that would be weird. It's not a shoe. It's a book. That's not what a book is intended for. And a political thriller isn't intended to function as a comedy or a musical or whatever. And so similarly, I'm not trying to make any sort of statement, not even a nuanced statement, no statement at all, about police brutality or about good cops or anything. That's not what the character is about. She's one person. And I'm trying to get something about her that's real, accurate, it exists, and it's compelling on the page. And that's what I've chosen. And I guess you could say as a criticism that, well, yeah, Barry, but then all you're doing is funneling the dominant narrative that cops are heroes, and and there's no police brutality or anything like that. That's fair. I think that's fair. There are only so many things you can write, and to that I would just have to say that is not how I write. I don't start with like, what's the political point I want to make ever, even on the most transparently political issues I've dealt with, like say bulk surveillance. I didn't think it is time for me to write a novel about bulk surveillance in a way that will change people's minds and get them to agree with me that bulk surveillance is a danger to democracy. It wasn't like that. It actually started with a character. I'm like, what if there's someone and she's in the NSA and she encounters something that like bothers her conscience. And that interests me because of the human element. She's like, you know, you got your job and you need your income. We all face this sort of dilemma. She doesn't want to speak out, but the more she learns about the program, the more it bothers her as a citizen. And I'm like, yeah. And only then did I start to think about, well, what would the program even be? And Livia's like that. I didn't think like, oh, I'm going to create a character who's going to be the last word on good cops or bad cops. Or it's just not like that. The book didn't start anything remotely like that. It wound up where it wound up because I care so much about the character. I think that's what makes good fiction. I may be wrong. There may be lots of other good fiction out there that started with I'm going to make a political point. I bet it's rare if it exists at all, but it could exist. So that's what I would say. And sorry, I know my answers have been long today, but this one I've been thinking about in light of the protests. I think Livia is heroic. I love her. I cry when I write those books. I wrote a lot of the first one, Livia Alone, in a Seattle coffee shop because it was set in Seattle. And I was crying a lot while I was writing on my laptop. And I was like, oh my God, these people must think I'm like, somebody's going to come over to the table and say, sir, can I help you? But it's Seattle and people mind their own business and nobody did. That's where I'm coming from about Livia. My first approach is she's human, she's damaged, she's as three-dimensional as I can get her. And I'm going to be as true to her as possible, true to her, not to something that's happening politically or to my political views or any sort of political or social justice movement. And it's not that I don't care about those things. I hope that after 2 hours plus talking to me, it's obvious I care deeply about those things, but they're not where my characters come from. And I don't want those things to be where my characters come from. My characters aren't messages, they're people. That's the way I feel about it.
And last question I had is, are there any other either kind of broadly leftist or anti-war or anti-imperialist kind of thriller authors you can recommend or think of?
It's a great question. I mean, you know, we've already mentioned George Orwell, who's not contemporary, but he would be at the top of my list. I am not familiar with anyone else who's writing what I would consider, what I think you could say, broadly speaking, are leftist thrillers. I don't think of them that way. I just think of them as almost like alternative thrillers. Like instead of all the American operatives being just, you know, good, nice and shining armor, you know, with flaws to make them more appealing as they can, but basically good people like Jack Bauer or whatever. And all the bad guys being evil terrorists who are fanatically, you know, committed to destroying us because they hate us for our freedoms and that sort of thing. I try to do things that are much more complex and as real as I can make them based on everything I know about humanity, primarily. And I guess what comes out of that is what might broadly be recognized as leftist, even though it's not, I don't really think of it that way. But I don't know of any other thriller writers who are doing thrillers like mine. I'd like to. I'd be very curious to see how anyone else is approaching this. Do you know of any?
I'd have to go back to maybe Robert Ludlum, who I think has at least kind of anti-authoritarian themes. And
that's fair. I read it was way back in the day. I read The Bourne Identity. It was a good thriller. I guess it wasn't enough for me to want to read the whole series or whatever. But yeah, you're right. You're right about that. That's a good point.
And I think John Grisham, I think he's probably more, you know, liberal than a leftist, but you know, some of his books.
That's fair.
They touch on like
that's a good point. You're definitely more liberal than leftist, but it's about the little guy standing up to the big insurance company or corporation. I haven't read that many of his books, a few, and that's definitely a theme. So you're right. Although in fairness, as you pointed out, I think those are more liberal politics. Not that there's anything wrong with them.
Right.
There's a lot that's right, but they're, you know, questioning the orthodoxies of Americanism is what I would call, what I think is a little more leftist, is certainly not liberal. And I don't see that in his books. But I've only read a few, so I don't know.
Yeah, but like you, I'm kind of hard pressed to think of many, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, and it's too bad because like this is an opportunity, and of course this is self-interested, so take it for what it's worth. But this is an opportunity that the left is missing for itself, because when Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck turned Brad Thor and I want to say Mitch Rapp, not Mitch Rapp, that's the character,
Vince
Flynn into, thank you. into monster bestsellers. There's a signal there. Write this kind of thriller, get Rush Limbaugh's attention and Glenn Beck's, they'll bring you on the show, you'll sell 1 million copies. That's not dumb, tactically. And the left doesn't do anything like that. So I'm like, look, truly, it doesn't have to be me. I'm the only leftist thriller writer I'm aware of. There've got to be others, and I would really like to know them. But to the extent there's another leftist thriller writer, hey, left media, liberal media, whatever, introduce people to that book. Get the book out there. You will do great work in bolstering your own political narratives by introducing it to people in a fictional context. That's very important. That's a big part of persuasion. So you'll be doing great work in that regard, but then also you can signal to other novelists that if you write a leftist novel, you'll be on whatever, The Daily Show or Colbert, or I don't know what, when I don't really watch that many of these shows, but like some leftist show, or Rachel Maddow, she's liberal. I would never describe her as left, but bring one of these, John Grisham doesn't need it, but bring, one of these authors who has like a liberal message that you love, a novel, bring that person on your show, have the sales go through the roof, and then signal to people that, hey, if you write a liberal novel or a leftist novel or whatever, you're going to get a lot of leftist media attention, liberal media attention. You'll sell a bazillion copies. Encourage people to do this. I think all the way back to your earlier question of, do you think there are more rightist or leftist political thriller readers? I don't really know the answer. But I do know that there's a big media operation to bring rightist thrillers to the attention of people who are inclined to read them. I am totally unaware of anything remotely like that exists on the left. And I think it's all part of the left not being good at sales. The left just doesn't understand what a long game politics is, and they just think, because hey, we've got a product that anybody would want, we're done here. I'm like, you don't know how implacable and skilled your adversary is, your opponents are. They understand that their product is inferior and they've got to sell it so much better at every level, and they're doing it, and they are definitely outclassing you. So this is one area, and for what it's worth, everybody thinks their own thing is the most important thing. There's this line I love in one of my favorite movies ever, Shakespeare in Love, where they're all in the tavern and someone asks Ralph, the guy who's playing the nurse in Romeo and Juliet, this tavern worker says to him, "What's the play about?" And he says, "Well, there's this nurse." Yeah, that's humanity to a T. So of course, because I'm a novelist, I'm like, hey, left, what you're missing is the importance of novels, and you should be promoting novels. So, discount anything I just said appropriately, accordingly. But I think there's something to it. And let me at least put it this way. Maybe the right is wrong in thinking that they should promote rightist narratives, fictional narratives, whether it's a show like 24 or novels. Maybe they're mistaken in thinking that, but they're pretty shrewd salespeople, and they think this is cost effective for them. Are you so sure they're wrong? And on the assumption that they're not wrong, maybe the one who's wrong is you, and you should think about how you can step up your game in introducing your narrative into the public consciousness through means like fiction. Hopefully someone will be listening.
Well,
Praveen, tell me really quickly, like, are you at Stanford Medical School?
Yeah, I am.
And you got a master? I just checked you out online. You got a master's in public health.
Yeah, I go to Johns Hopkins.
Totally cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, this is not really like related to any of my professional goals, but it was just kind of something I'm interested in and passionate about. Both thrillers and fiction, and also kind of anti-war, anti-imperialist kind of politics.
That's wonderful.
Thanks.
That's awesome that you're writing for current affairs. Is this a regular gig or?
Oh no, I just pitched them something, and I never expected them to take me up on it, but then I got an email from them, and I'm really excited about it.
This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. I mean, I don't know what their readership is. And again, please discount my selfish interest in the thought that, oh, it's great if anything that's about me will help me sell more books, and that's good for the way I make a living. Of course, that's always going to make me happy. I want to be transparent about that. But really, if I were to read an article in Current Affairs about some other leftist thriller writer, I might say like, hey, how'd they not know me? I've been doing this for years. But that would be like a fleeting and unimportant feeling. I'd be like, okay, this is what I'm talking about. You go Current Affairs. Or like The Intercept. I love The Intercept. They're a regular read for me. And I listen every week to Jeremy Scahill's podcast, Intercepted, Mehdi Hassan's Deconstructed, and now Glenn's is, I think, one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to, System Update.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeremy in particular covers sometimes poetry and often music, which I think is wonderful. But I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
dude, where's the fiction? Cover some fiction. I don't think it's that, like, again, get these narratives out there. And truly, hey, if you want to make it mine, I'll be doubly delighted. But I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about narratives that the left should be promoting. So congratulations. I think it's wonderful that you have the
Thank you.
insight that this is something pitchable. I've been saying this for a long time and haven't really gotten much traction with my efforts.
Well, yeah, I mean, thanks so much for agreeing to this. And, I'm not used to interviewing people, so sorry if there was any kind of awkwardness or anything like that.
Praveen, you're a great interviewer. I mean,
Thanks.
And the secret to being a good interviewer, in my having been on the other end of it, or both ends of it actually, many times, is just learn about the subject.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not good. It would take a hell of an interviewer not to know anything about the subject and turn it into a good interview. And yeah, my books and your politics. And so thank you for your questions. You asked me a lot that I've never been asked before and I haven't thought that much about. So that made the whole thing really fun for me. I'm grateful.
Oh, great. Yeah, and I hope I didn't take up too much of your time.
No, I really enjoyed chatting with you. I'm sorry I was doing most of the talking, but
oh no, that's what I expected.
You were interviewing me. If there's anything else I can help with, you have any follow-up questions, please just get in touch. If you happen to be talking to Nathan, I doubt he even knows who I am, but please tell him that he's got a multi-generational clan of fans here on the West Coast.
Oh, sure.
Fans. And yeah, and anything else I can help with the article, please just let me know. I'm looking forward
great. Well, yeah, thank you so much. And it was really great talking to you. And I'm looking forward to the next book.
Thank you. I'm working on it all the time, just not in the last 3 hours. I'm going to get back to it now. And good luck with everything, with your studies and
thank
your
you.
side job writing about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Cheers. I hope we'll run into each other in the real world when such things are permissible.
All right. Okay. Bye.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Oh, you too.